Chapter 1061. The Tian clan girl chuckled. Xiao Chen put away his thoughts and looked at the girl's face. He chuckled and said, "After talking so much, I still don't know your name." "Hee hee, you can call me Yu-er." The girl chuckled and replied. "Yu-er." The smile on Xiao Chen's face turned a little devilish. "Yu-er, I'm afraid that's not your real name." Xiao Chen naturally did not believe that the girl's real name was Yu-er. However, he did not pursue the matter. After a pause, Xiao Chen continued with a smile. "But it doesn't matter. Whether it's real or fake, I'll call you Yu-er. Miss Yu-er, you must be from 9 Heavens, right?" Xiao Chen smiled. Miss Yu-er had taken the initiative to visit and said so much. He could not rule out the possibility that she was trying to drive a wedge between them. Yu-er did not hide the truth from Xiao Chen and nodded slightly, admitting that she was from 9 Heavens. They were both from a quasi-saint sect. Xiao Chen did not say anything after Yu-er nodded. Instead, it was Yu-er who continued to smile. "Why? Does the Chosen think that I'm trying to drive a wedge between the Sacred Palace and the Liwang sect? Isn't that the case?" Xiao Chen asked instead of answering. Yu-er stood up without the slightest hint of panic on her face when she heard Xiao Chen's words. "You can think whatever you want. In any case, I'm only here to take a look. If the first Chosen of the Sacred Palace and the first Chosen of the Liwang sect meet, it might be very interesting. As for how you decide, that's your business. However, don't blame me for not reminding you that Tong Huang is very powerful." Yu-er skipped out of the courtyard without waiting for Xiao Chen's reply. Xiao Chen did not stop her. Without Xiao Chen's orders, the guards chose to let her pass. Looking at Yu-er's back, Xiao Chen had suspected that her intentions were impure, but now it seemed that she was just doing it for fun. However, from her words, Xiao Chen could tell that she was very familiar with Tong Huang. A smile flashed across his eyes. Xiao Chen smiled and said, "Looks like it should be her." He guessed Yu-er's identity, but Yu-er had already left, leaving Xiao Chen alone in the hall. With no one around, Xiao Chen began to quietly ponder about the supreme-grade spiritual vein. In the past, the human race did not have much say, so the supreme-grade spirit veins on the 100-fold continent could only be handed over to the Liwang sect. But now that the human race had the Sacred Palace, the ownership of supreme-grade spirit veins in the territory of the human race had to be redefined. The Liwang sect had obviously thought of this as well, which was why they had sent Tong Huang over. Xiao Chen only had 2 choices now. He could either pretend that he did not know about this matter and return to the Sacred Palace as planned. As for the supreme-grade spirit vein, he would still leave it to the Liwang sect. This was the first choice. As for the second choice, it was naturally to compete with Tong Huang for the supreme-grade spirit vein. However, if he did so, Xiao Chen would inevitably become enemies with Tong Huang. Should he choose to become enemies with Tong Huang and obtain the supreme-grade spirit vein's ownership, or should he return to the Sacred Palace for safety's sake? Xiao Chen weighed the pros and cons in his heart. It did not take long for him to come to a decision. A look of determination flashed across his eyes. Since it originally belonged to the human race, there's naturally no reason not to take action. It doesn't matter even if we have to compete with Tong Huang. It belongs to the human race, so it must be in the hands of the human race. If he wanted to compete, even if his opponent was Tong Huang, he had to compete. Xiao Chen understood very well that although the Sacred Palace had developed rapidly during this period, this was because many human race forces had chosen to become affiliated sects of the Sacred Palace. It was precisely because of these human race forces that the Sacred Palace had developed so rapidly. However, the Sacred Palace's foundation was still somewhat lacking. Therefore, if the Sacred Palace wanted to gain a firm foothold in the North Star boundary, they had to find a way to obtain more resources, such as essential resources like spirit veins. If they wanted to obtain resources, they had to snatch food from the jaws of the tigers from the hands of the other 6 major sacred sections. This was a must. and the resources that originally belonged to the human race but had been seized by the 6 major sacred sects were the sacred palace's first choice. After all, since it was in the human race's territory, it should belong to the human race and the sacred palace. There was no doubt about this. Just like the spirit veins on the Taishan continent, all of them were under the control of the Supreme Saint sect. Shao Chen quickly made up his mind that he could not hand it over to the Liwang sect. A sect, especially a quasi-saint sect, in addition to possessing powerful battle strength, must also have sufficient resources to support it for a long time. With this thought, Shao Chen also prepared to change his plan. He would first obtain the supreme-grade spirit vein on the Bai Mo continent. Just as Shao Chen was making his decision, Zhou Fan, who was in Baimo Xingzong, also sent a message back to inform Shao Chen that Tong Huang and the others had left Baimo Xingzong. Tong Huang and the others had left Baimo Xingzong. It was obvious that they had gone to the supreme-grade spirit vein. After receiving the news, Shao Chen asked Zhou Fan to immediately rush back to Gu City. After instructing Zhou Fan, Shao Chen's eyes flashed. He looked ahead and said indifferently, Tong Huang, Liwang sect, there are some things that should be returned to the human race. With that, Shao Chen left the front hall and prepared to tell everyone about this matter. He only needed to wait for Zhou Fan to return so that he could set off for the supreme-grade spirit vein and take back control of it. The sacred palace did not even have a single supreme-grade spirit vein so far. Therefore, it was absolutely impossible to give the supreme-grade spirit vein on the Bai Mo continent to the Liwang sect. This was especially true now that the sacred palace had the qualifications to compete with the Liwang sect. Just as Shao Chen made up his mind, Yu Er, who had just left the courtyard, was greeted by a young Sky Clan girl who also had a mark on her forehead. She looked at Yu Er and asked with a smile, Holy Maiden, how is it? Nothing much. I've already told Shao Chen about this matter. As for what he chooses, it's naturally up to him. Oh, Holy Maiden, what do you think he will choose? An expectant smile appeared on Yu Er's face when she heard this. How will he choose? There should be a good show to watch soon. The number 1 chosen of the Sacred Palace versus the number 1 chosen of the Liwang sect. It's really not bad. I didn't expect to personally bring about such a good show when I came to the Bai Mo continent by chance. Let's not waste any more time and go to the Supreme Grade Spirit Vein to watch the show. Begging for your collection, begging for monthly votes, begging for recommendations. End of chapter. Chapter 1062. Martial artists cultivated, fought for opportunities, fought for cultivation methods, and fought for treasures. These were the struggles of individual martial artists, and just like the struggles of personal opinions, the struggles between sects were nothing more than these. Only with enough resources could a sect flourish for a long time and become more and more powerful. But now, the newly established sacred palace was like a rootless duckweed. It looked powerful, but its foundation was too strong. In particular, the resources in its hands were pitifully little compared to the other 6 quasi-saint sections. Perhaps nothing could be seen in a short period of time, but as time passed, the sacred palace would most likely face many problems. At that time, the sacred palace wouldn't even need others to do anything. The sacred palace would fend for itself. Therefore, resources were very important. Since the sacred palace had rewarded them, they naturally had to seize the resources, especially the resources that once belonged to the human race. Only by truly grasping these resources in their hands could the sacred palace truly contend with the other 6 quasi-saint sections. Quickly returning to the backyard, Shao Chen gathered Guduwia, Huangfu Ao, and the others. Of course, Qin Shuru and the other 2 girls were also present. Everyone gathered together. Shao Chen didn't beat around the bush and went straight to the point. There is a supreme-grade spirit vein on the Bai Mo continent, but it's in the hands of the Liwang sect. I guess the people of the Liwang sect might have descended because of this. he directly told everyone about the supreme grade spirit vein. Hearing this, everyone present was intelligent and quickly understood what Xiao Chen meant. Ouyang Roshua spoke at this time. You want to snatch it? Ouyang Roshua spoke out Xiao Chen's thoughts, but it wasn't accurate. In response, Xiao Chen smiled and shook his head. Junior sister Ouyang, this is not snatching. It originally belonged to us. The Bai-Mo continent is the territory of the human race. Since this supreme grade spirit vein is located on the Bai-Mo continent, shouldn't it belong to our sacred palace? The human race was once weak, but now that we have the sacred palace, it's time to take back what once belonged to us. Therefore, junior sister Ouyang, we are not robbing. Huang Fuao was the first to support Xiao Chen. That's right. Brother Xiao Chen is right. Since this supreme grade spirit vein is located on the 100mo continent, it belongs to our human race. We couldn't do anything before because we weren't strong enough, but now that we have the strength, we have to take it back no matter what. Huang Fuao agreed, and the rest of the crowd followed suit. No one objected, and they all agreed with Xiao Chen's decision. As disciples of the sacred palace, they were naturally not afraid of the Liwang sect. The supreme grade spirit vein was very precious, so they naturally couldn't just let it go. If they had the strength, they would definitely snatch it back. Everyone had the same opinion. Seeing this, Xiao Chen smiled slightly, then said softly, Okay, then we'll wait for Deacon Zhoufan to return. We'll immediately set off for the supreme grade spirit vein. Just as Xiao Chen and the others decided to set off, Tong Huang and the other Liwang sect members were already on their way. Because they weren't flying in the starry sky, the starship wasn't moving very fast. Standing on the deck, Wang Zhong looked at Tong Huang in front of him and asked, Senior brother Tong Huang, I have a feeling that the sacred palace won't just stand by and do nothing this time. Since Xiao Chen is on the Bai-Mo continent, he definitely won't just give up on this supreme grade spirit vein. After all, this is the territory of the human race. Xiao Chen and the others knew that Tong Huang and the others had arrived on the Bai-Mo continent. Similarly, Tong Huang also knew that Xiao Chen was on the Bai-Mo continent. As for how he found out, the Liwang sect naturally had their own channels. Moreover, Xiao Chen didn't deliberately hide his whereabouts when he came to the Bai-Mo continent, so it wasn't difficult to find out. Otherwise, you wouldn't have come looking for him personally. Upon hearing Wang Zhong's words, Tong Huang didn't seem to care at all and smiled slightly. So what if we don't stand by and do nothing? Strength speaks for itself. If Xiao Chen is really strong, what's the harm in returning this supreme grade spirit vein to him? Furthermore, I'm very curious about the first holy son of the sacred palace. I want to see if he's worthy of being compared to us. Wang Zhong didn't care about Xiao Chen. Upon hearing Tong Huang's words, a look of disdain appeared on his face. How can Xiao Chen be compared to senior brother Tong Huang? Back in the Tian Yen sect's secret realm, Xiao Chen wasn't Mosie's opponent at all. His strength is still far from the first holy son's. Wang Zhong had personally witnessed Xiao Chen's strength. In his opinion, there was still a huge gap between Xiao Chen and the first holy son. Of course, what Wang Zhong didn't know was that was a few months ago. With the awakening of the Heavenly Path Sword Embryo and the Dustless Sword, Xiao Chen's strength had already undergone earth-shattering changes. In the face of Wang Zhong's disdain, Tong Huang smiled and said, In that case, there's even less need to worry. If he wants you to take back the supreme grade spirit vein without strength, he'll only be asking for humiliation. He didn't take Xiao Chen seriously at all. Half a day later, Tong Huang and the others arrived at the supreme grade spirit vein on the 100mo continent. A small city stood at the foot of a huge mountain. The supreme grade spirit vein was located in the interior of this mountain range, and it extended all the way to the ground. This city was built by the Liwang sect personally to protect this supreme grade spirit vein. There were experts from the Liwang sect guarding the city. In addition, there were simple tents around the city. In these tents lived ordinary humans with low or no cultivation. However, all of these humans looked very thin, and their clothes were very dirty and messy. There were a lot of them. There were at least 100,000 of them who looked extremely miserable. They only had one purpose here, and that was to mine the spirit vein. They had to work every day, and there were also heavy tasks. If they couldn't complete them, they would naturally be beaten up. To put it bluntly, these humans were slaves here. Barbarian warriors stood guard around the human tent area. When they looked at these humans, their eyes were full of disdain and ridicule. Perhaps they had been abused for too long, but there was no light in these humans' eyes. They were all like walking corpses as they carried on with their task. There were more than 100,000 slaves here, but they had no human rights. They were even worse than pigs and dogs. It had to be said that this was indeed the tragedy of the week. Because the human race was not strong enough, the barbarian race not only snatched the spirit vein that originally belonged to the human race, but also captured humans as slaves to mine the spirit vein for them. From time to time, they would humiliate, beat, and scold these human slaves. Begging for your collection, begging for monthly votes, begging for recommendations. End of chapter. Chapter 1063. At the foot of the mountain, there were more than 10 caves that were connected to the interior of the mountain. Many human slaves passed through these caves to enter the spirit vein to mine. In addition to the people in charge of mining, there were also slaves who were in charge of carrying spirit stones and other useless gravel out of the spirit vein. Each of these human slaves carried a huge basket on their back. The basket was filled with gravel. As these human slaves were even worse than pigs and dogs, it was naturally impossible for the barbarian race to provide them with space rings. These gravel were excavated during the process of mining the spirit vein. Every day, these human slaves had to carry out a large number of gravel. It was still all right for those who had a cultivation base, but for those who did not, it was extremely difficult for them to carry these baskets. Moreover, in these caves there were burly barbarians holding whips in their hands, constantly forcing the human slaves to walk faster. Anyone who was slightly slow would be whipped without a second word. The number of human slaves who had been beaten to death by these barbarians was not a small number here. In fact, they could be seen almost every day. There was a mass grave not far from the shack area where the human slaves lived. It was densely packed with graves. These people were either beaten to death or starved to death by the barbarian tribe. The barbarian tribe never had to care about the physical condition of these human slaves, nor did they care about their lives. This was because in the eyes of the barbarian tribe, these human slaves were the poorest things in the world. They were worthless. If they died, then they died. At worst, they could just go around and catch some more. After all, what would the human race dare to say? Some big families even took the initiative to send batches of slaves over when they heard that the barbarian tribe needed slaves. It was precisely because they had an endless supply of human slaves that the barbarian tribe did not have the slightest bit of mercy. Walk faster, you old thing. Today you have to carry 50 times. Until now you've only done it 5 times. Let me tell you, if you don't finish, today will be the day you die. A barbarian tribe man was holding a whip and constantly whipping a human old man who had no cultivation base. This old man didn't look young anymore. Although his hair wasn't completely white, the wrinkles on his face showed that he wasn't young anymore. He was an old man, but his daily tasks were extremely heavy. Indeed, he could not carry them anymore. However, the barbarian race did not care about this at all. They looked as if they wanted to beat him to death. Lying weakly on the ground, the whip lashed out at the old man's back. The broken stones in the basket were scattered on the ground. The old man didn't even have the strength to scream after being mercilessly whipped. Not only was there a heavy workload every day, but there was almost no food to eat. Even if there was, it was almost no different from pig feed. Even so, each person could not even get a bowl of it. Without enough food, and having to complete the arduous work every day, one could imagine how much damage this would cause to a person without cultivation. Judging from the old man's appearance, it would be difficult for him to stand up again. Seeing this, a murderous look flashed across the barbarian's eyes. He then raised his arm high and lashed out with his whip as he shouted coldly, "Old man, what's the use of keeping you alive? Go to hell." The old man could be said to be at the end of his life. Without labor, he was naturally a good-for-nothing. The barbarian race had a very simple way to deal with good-for-nothings, which was to kill them. He wanted to whip the old man to death, but at the critical moment, the whip was caught in someone's hand. The person who appeared was also a human slave. However, he was very young. Although his body was thin and weak, he could be considered to be relatively healthy. Moreover, judging from the aura on his body, this young man actually had the cultivation of the heaven realm. With cultivation, his strength was naturally greater than that of an ordinary person. The appearance of the young man saved the old man. Seeing this, the barbarian race shouted coldly, "Are you looking for death?" Faced with the barbarian race's shout, the young man was unmoved. However, the other human slaves beside him laughed nervously and advised him, "Chen Zhong, forget it. Don't do this. You'll be beaten to death." The young man's name was Chen Zhong. He was captured 3 years ago and became a slave here. Because of his cultivation, his honesty and his kindness, he had a lot of prestige among the crowd. At this moment, seeing Chen Zhong stand up for the old man, many of the human slaves around him began to persuade him in whispers. Nothing good would come out of going against the barbarian tribe here. However, Chen Zhong completely ignored everyone's persuasion. His eyes were still fixed on the barbarian tribe's leader. Completely angered by Chen Zhong's attitude, the barbarian race immediately shouted angrily, "If you want to die, I'll fulfill your wish." As he spoke, he sent out a signal. Soon, 3 barbarian race guards rushed over. A total of 4 barbarian race guards surrounded Chen Zhong tightly. In fact, Chen Zhong should have gotten used to such a life over the past 3 years. However, recently, Chen Zhong inadvertently heard about the sacred palace from a casual conversation between 2 barbarian race guards. When he heard that the human race also had their own secondary saint sect, Chen Zhong was extremely excited. He knew very well that the reason why the human race here had fallen to such a state was because the human race was weak. However, now that the human race also had their own secondary saint sect, did that mean that there was hope for him and the hundreds of thousands of human slaves here? Suddenly there was hope. Chen Zhong had been fantasizing for the past few days that one day, the people of the sacred palace would descend here and chase these barbarians away, allowing the hundreds of thousands of humans here to return to their hometowns. It was because of this hope in his heart that Chen Zhong shouted angrily as he was surrounded by the 4 brute race guards. His eyes were filled with hatred. "How long do you think you can be happy for? The sacred palace of the human race has already been established. It won't be long before the sacred palace comes here." The sacred palace was Chen Zhong's hope. However, when the guard heard his words, he sneered and said, "Sacred palace? Talk about it when you're alive." These barbarian race guards naturally knew about the establishment of the sacred palace. However, in their opinion, the sacred palace was too far away from them. They were just small fry at the bottom, and were destined to have no contact with the sacred palace. These matters should be left to the big shots of the Liwang sect to worry about. In any case, they only needed to obey orders. As long as the Liwang sect did not announce their withdrawal, they would not have to worry about anything. As he spoke, the barbarian race guard threw a punch straight at Chen Zhong. Just when everyone thought that Chen Zhong was definitely going to die, the barbarian race guard who took the initiative to attack was inexplicably sent flying without warning. Please add, please vote, please recommend. End of chapter. Chapter 1064. The barbarian guard, who was about to kill, was sent flying for some unknown reason. He spat out a large mouthful of blood and slammed into the mountain wall. No one knew if he was dead or alive. The sudden change left many human slaves in the surroundings dumbfounded. At the same time, the remaining 3 barbarian guards also became alert, as if they were facing a formidable enemy. One of them even took out a signal and sent out more guards to support them. No one knew what had happened. While everyone was looking at each other in confusion, Xiao Chen, dressed in the Chosen's robes, appeared in front of Chen Zhong without any warning. Xiao Chen appeared alone. As for Gudu Wuya and the others, they were still behind him. Xiao Chen decided to take a look at the spirit vein first because he was fast. He did not intend to alert the enemy, but after seeing what had just happened, Xiao Chen could not hold back. Xiao Chen's appearance stunned everyone present. However, Chen Zhong, who was standing behind Xiao Chen, quickly regained his senses. When he saw the totem-like, sacred word embroidered on the back of the golden robe, Chen Zhong could not help but tremble. The sacred palace. Chen Zhong's first thought was the sacred palace. He then looked at Xiao Chen's back, which was not very broad, but was definitely majestic. Chen Zhong did not expect that someone from the sacred palace would actually show up here. Chen Zhong had always hoped that the people from the sacred palace would appear one day and rescue everyone. However, deep down, Chen Zhong knew that this was not very likely. The Bimo continent was too small. It was impossible for a colossus like the sacred palace to set their sights on this place. Even if there was a chance, it would be a long time in the future. But he did not expect the experts from the sacred palace to really come, and so quickly. Ignoring the excited Chen Zhong behind him, Xiao Chen looked at the 3 barbarian guards in front of him. Following Xiao Chen's appearance, more and more guards gathered after receiving the signal. In just a few moments, there were dozens of barbarian guards. These barbarian guards did not have high cultivation. Basically, they were only at the Dao querying realm. In Xiao Chen's eyes, they could not be any weaker. They were nothing more than mere ants. However, it was apparent that these ants were unable to see through Xiao Chen's disguise. As such, they were still yelling at Xiao Chen, taking advantage of their numbers. Human race? Who are you? How dare you barge into the spirit vein of the Liwang sect? Are you courting death? Xiao Chen had a cold smile on his face when he heard the scolding of these ants. He glanced at the barbarian guards one by one and then said in an indifferent voice, "Don't worry. A bunch of ants. How dare you treat my human race like this?" He did not see Xiao Chen do anything as he spoke, but he felt an extremely terrifying and sharp sword will gushing out of Xiao Chen's body at the same time. With the appearance of this sword essence, the dozens of barbarian guards did not have the strength to resist. They were almost instantly torn to shreds by this sword essence. The blood mist that filled the sky, the perfect level sword intent, how could these ants be able to withstand it? Chen Zhong, who was standing behind Xiao Chen, felt as if he was in a dream when he saw how easily Xiao Chen killed the barbarian guards without even lifting his hand. Chen Zhong, who was standing behind Xiao Chen, felt as if he was in a dream. He was completely stunned until Xiao Chen turned around and looked at him. "You're not bad." Chen Zhong only came back to his senses when Xiao Chen turned around and looked at him. "You're not bad. You're not bad." These 4 simple words showed that Xiao Chen had a good impression on Chen Zhong. It was also because Xiao Chen turned around and said these words that Chen Zhong saw Xiao Chen's face clearly. At first glance, Chen Zhong's impression of Xiao Chen was that he was heroic. He had sharp eyebrows and bright eyes. The strong confidence and pressure he exuded from between his brows made people not dare to look him in the eye. Chen Zhong instinctively lowered his head. He did not even know how to respond to Xiao Chen. He could only keep muttering in his heart. "Is this an expert from the sacred palace?" It was difficult for him to look Xiao Chen in the eye, let alone talk to him. However, when Chen Zhong lowered his head, a terrifying aura swept over. After that, A Tao King Realm barbarian appeared in the sky and looked down at Shao Chen. This Tao King Realm barbarian should be one of the managers of this spirit vein. He was originally receiving Tong Huang solemnly, but who knew that something would suddenly happen at the spirit vein, so he hurried over. He originally intended to kill Shao Chen directly, but as a Tao King Realm manager, this barbarian was naturally no fool. So when he saw Shao Chen, he quickly sensed that Shao Chen was not ordinary. As a result, he did not choose to attack immediately. Instead, he asked cautiously, "Who are you? Why have you trespassed into my Li Wang Sec's spirit vein?" Shao Chen's aura was extraordinary, so it was naturally impossible for someone like him to be simple. So, the barbarian did not attack rashly. However, Shao Chen spoke indifferently when he heard his question. "You don't deserve to know who I am. I know Tong Huang is here. Get him to come see me personally." The barbarian's status was too low, so Shao Chen couldn't be bothered to waste his breath on him. He directly said that he wanted to see Tong Huang. The barbarian was clearly stunned when he heard the name Tong Huang. He naturally knew that Tong Huang had come to the spirit vein. He was receiving Tong Huang earlier. Of course, a nobody like him would not have the chance to speak to Tong Huang at all. To him, Tong Huang was already an extraordinary figure. However, this human youth in front of him wanted to see Tong Huang as soon as he spoke. For a moment, the Tao King barbarian was stunned. Fortunately, while the barbarian was still in a daze, Tong Huang and Wang Zhong appeared in the sky. Their sudden appearance shocked everyone again. However, Tong Huang did not care about anyone else, including the barbarian. As soon as he appeared, his eyes locked onto Shao Chen. There was a faint smile on his rough face. "It seems like you're not as bad as Wang Zhong said." Obviously, Tong Huang already knew Shao Chen's identity. At the same time, Shao Chen also knew Tong Huang's identity. Tong Huang was probably the only person in the entire North Star domain who could make Wang Zhong willingly accompany him. Therefore, when he heard Tong Huang's words, Shao Chen spoke indifferently. "However, you've disappointed me. Is that so? But I think you won't have such thoughts in a while." When he heard Shao Chen's words, Tong Huang was not angry. Instead, he continued to speak with a faint smile. "Begging for your collection, begging for monthly votes, begging for recommendations." End of chapter. Chapter 1065. With Tong Huang's appearance, the two finally met. As the first chosen of their respective sects, and the number one of the younger generation, Shao Chen and Tong Huang had been sizing each other up since the beginning. It had to be said that both of them were like dragons and phoenixes among men. Tong Huang was tall and burly. Although his face was a little rough, he was extremely domineering and despicable. On the other hand, although Shao Chen's figure was not even 1/10 of Tong Huang's, and he was even a little thin, Shao Chen had sharp eyebrows, bright eyes, and a tall and straight waist. As he stood there, he was like a sharp jian-yi that was about to be unsheathed. He gave off a sharp feeling. The Tao King Realm Brute standing on Tong Huang's right was completely stunned as he listened to the conversation between Tong Huang and Shao Chen. Firstly, it was because of Tong Huang. With his status, he naturally felt a lot of pressure when facing Tong Huang, so much so that it was ridiculous, as if the sky was about to collapse. In addition, he was curious about Shao Chen's identity. This young human seemed to be in existence on the same level as Tong Huang. Who was Tong Huang? What kind of people were on the same level as him? Even though this Tao King Realm barbarian's status wasn't high, he still knew the general situation of the North Star boundary. He knew that with Emperor Tong's status, there were definitely less than 5 people in the entire North Star boundary who could reach the same level as him. He could even count them with his fingers. As if he could read the brute's mind, Tong Huang turned his head to look at him without warning and said, "Why? Are you curious about this human's identity?" When he heard Tong Huang's sudden words, The brute was so stunned that he even forgot to reply. However, Tong Huang did not mind and smiled as if he was answering his own question. Listen carefully. This human below is the first chosen of the sacred palace, Shao Chen. In fact, he is indeed on par with me, haha. Tong Huang took the initiative to announce Shao Chen's identity to the public. Moreover, he had no intention of hiding anything, so everyone present heard him clearly, including the many human slaves. The first sacred son of the sacred palace. Chen Zhong did not know how to describe his current feelings after hearing this. He originally thought that Shao Chen was just an ordinary disciple of the sacred palace. Who would have thought that he would be such a top figure? The smile on Tong Huang's face grew even brighter when he saw that everyone was stunned. It's a pity that someone who can stand on par with me will not be able to walk out of here today. With that, Tong Huang locked his gaze on Shao Chen again and said in a mocking tone, "I really admire you, Shao Chen. You dared to come to my territory alone. Do you really think that no one in this world can do anything to you? Or do you think that I'm stupid enough to fight you fairly? That I would give up such an excellent opportunity to kill you?" As Tong Huang finished speaking, more than a dozen brute race experts appeared beside Tong Huang. The weakest of these brute race experts was at the Tao King realm, and there were even 2 half-saints among them. This group of people should be the experts sent by the Li Wang sect to guard the supreme grade spirit vein. With their appearance, Tong Huang's intention was very clear. Since Shao Chen dared to come here alone, there was nothing to say. They would surround and kill Shao Chen right here and now. Shao Chen did not panic in the face of more than a dozen Li Wang sect experts. Shao Chen said indifferently, "Who said that I came here alone?" As he spoke, the auras of Guduwuya and the others could be sensed from afar. Soon, Guduwuya and the others rushed to Shao Chen's side. Moreover, the sect master of Baimo Xingzong, a saint expert, was also with them. Upon hearing that Shao Chen wanted to take back the supreme grade spirit vein, Saint Baimo Xingzong did not hesitate at all. He immediately headed to Gu City with Zhou Fan to meet up with Shao Chen. Baimo Xingzong did not dare to do so before because the human race did not have the strength to resist the Li Wang sect. However, things were different now. With the appearance of the sacred palace, sect master Baimo Xingzong's fear of the Li Wang sect had practically vanished. As such, he would no longer feel the slightest psychological burden if he attacked the Li Wang sect. Tong Huang's expression did not change as he looked at Guduwuya, sect master Baimo Xingzong, and the others. As expected. "Tell me, are you here to take back the supreme grade spirit vein?" He was not nervous at all. Of course, this was also because Tong Huang was confident. Even with sect master Baimo Xingzong, a saint expert, Tong Huang was absolutely confident that he could escape safely. It was not easy for a saint expert to kill a chosen, especially the first chosen. Take Shao Chen for example. If he were to fight against a saint expert, it would naturally be impossible for him to win. However, it would not be too difficult for him to escape. Shao Chen was also fully confident in this. With the appearance of sect master Baimo Xingzong, the human race obviously had the upper hand. Moreover, it was an absolute advantage because the barbarian race did not have a saint expert here. This was the advantage of being on home ground. Although the Li Wang sect had occupied the supreme grade spirit vein, they did not send a saint expert to guard it. Thinking about it, even if it was a quasi-sage sect, every saint was a well-known figure. It was naturally impossible for them to guard the spirit vein. The fact that they could send 2 semi-saints was enough to show how much importance the Li Wang sect attached to this supreme grade spirit vein. Hearing Tong Huang's words, Shao Chen smiled coldly. "Originally, I came here to take back the supreme grade spirit vein, but now I have another condition." "I'm all ears," Tong Huang said with a smile. "That's your life," Shao Chen said. Previously, Tong Huang wanted to besiege and kill Shao Chen. Now, it seemed that Tong Huang was just joking because he knew that Xiao Chen would not be stupid enough to rush into the Li Wang sect's territory alone. However, this did not hinder Xiao Chen's thoughts. Now that they had an absolute advantage, and had an additional saint expert, Xiao Chen would naturally not let go of this excellent opportunity. If he could kill Tong Huang and Wang Zhong here, it would be a huge blow to the Li Wang sect. At this time, Xiao Chen would not use any trick. As if he had already guessed that Xiao Chen would say this, Tong Huang's expression did not change. He was not nervous at all and laughed loudly. Haha, Xiao Chen, do you really think that a mere saint expert is enough to keep me here? You and I are both the first Holy Son. You should know that it is not difficult for you to defeat the barbarians here and take back this supreme-grade spirit vein with the help of your subordinate. However, if you want to kill me here, I'm afraid that you are dreaming, right? Furthermore, at this point, Tong Huang paused and looked at the empty sky to his left. The smile on his face became slightly playful. Begging for your collection, begging for monthly votes, begging for recommendations. End of chapter. Chapter 1066. The Li Wang sect hadn't assigned any saints to guard the spirit vein, but this was normal. After all, why would a saint guard a spirit vein? Without any experts, and this was the territory of the human race, Baimo Xingzong hadn't dared to attack the Li Wang sect before. However, things were different now. The appearance of the sacred palace had given the human race and Baimo Xingzong something to rely on. Therefore, Baimo Xingzong no longer feared the Li Wang sect. However, Tong Huang wasn't too nervous in the face of the human race, who had the absolute advantage. It was indeed impossible for a saint to keep him here. Xiao Chen knew this very well. As the first chosen of the Li Wang sect, Xiao Chen would never believe that Tong Huang didn't have any tricks up his sleeve. At this moment, Tong Huang's gaze was fixed on the empty sky with a faint smile on his face. Tong Huang said slowly, "Don't worry about it. Moreover, you've been watching the show for so long. It's time for you to come out, Tianyue." Tianyue. Gudu Wuyao, who was standing behind Xiao Chen, was stunned when he heard this name. This name was simply too familiar. Although they had never seen it before, Gudu Wuyao and the others weren't unfamiliar with this name at all. This was because Tianyue was the first saintess of the 9 heavens. Compared to the shock of Gudu Wuyao and the others, Xiao Chen smiled and looked in the direction that Tong Huang was looking. Their gazes fell on the same area. Then, under their gazes, 2 Sky Clan girls with unique marks on their foreheads appeared in the sky without any warning. Xiao Chen recognized one of these girls. It was Yu who had come to Gu City to find him. The smile on his face grew even brighter as he looked at Yu. Without waiting for Tong Huang to speak, Xiao Chen spoke first. "Saintess Tianyue, I didn't expect to meet you again so soon." Xiao Chen had already guessed Tianyue's identity. After all, from her words, it seemed that she was very familiar with Tong Huang. As a Sky Clan member and a member of the same generation, only Tianyue could be familiar with Tong Huang. In response to Xiao Chen's chuckle, Tianyue's face also showed a smile. Together with her pure appearance, she looked like a young girl who was not in tune with the affairs of the world. However, no one present would think that she was a young girl. "I'm afraid that chosen Xiao Chen has already guessed my identity," Tianyue said with a smile. With Tianyue's appearance, everyone present was stunned. The number 1 saintess of 9 heavens, Tianyue, had actually appeared here. In this way, the number 1 saintess and saintess of 3 quasi-sage sects had gathered together. This was a rare scene. Everyone involuntarily looked at Tianyue. Although there were only 2 of them, no one dared to look down on them. Moreover, Xiao Chen and Tong Huang had a tacit understanding not to make a move. They didn't even think of making Tianyue stay here. This was because even though Tianyue was weak, the people present couldn't make her stay. The only thing they could do was to make the girl beside Tianyue stay. At the level of Xiao Chen, Tong Huang, and Tianyue, it could be said that there wasn't much danger in the North Star boundary. Unless a quasi-sage personally made a move, a saint wouldn't be able to make them stay. If they couldn't win, it wouldn't be a problem for them to leave. Tianyue's appearance made the development of the situation a little strange. Soon, Xiaoqin, Tong Huang, and Tianyue all soared into the sky. The three of them stood more than 10 meters apart. As for the others, they stood quietly at the side. In the current situation, only Xiaoqin and the other two had the right to speak. Even a saint-like sect master Baimo Xingzong didn't have the right to speak at this time. The three of them faced each other. After the conversation between Xiaoqin and Tianyue just now, Tong Huang also guessed something. He smiled and said to Tianyue, "It seems like you're the one who led Xiaoqin here, right?" Xiaoqin and Tianyue had obviously met before. Moreover, it was very likely that Xiaoqin had come here because of Tianyue. Tianyue didn't hide anything when she heard Tong Huang's words. She smiled very calmly and said, "I really want to see who's stronger between the Liwang sect and the sacred palaces first chosen." Tianyue's expression didn't change at all after being exposed by Tong Huang. The smile on her face didn't fade at all as she readily admitted it. Tianyue was the only female first holy son in the North Star boundary. In the North Star boundary, Tianyue was very famous. However, what was surprising was that very few people had actually seen Tianyue. Perhaps this had something to do with the traditions of the Sky Race. As an absolutely arrogant race, the Sky Race basically had very little contact with the outside world. As for Tianyue, it was said that her whereabouts were even more uncertain. Because of this, many people knew about her, but very few had actually seen her. Tianyue had deliberately told Xiaoqin about the supreme grade spirit vein. It could be said that she was trying to sow discord between the sacred palace and the Liwang sect. However, Tong Huang, who was no stranger to Tianyue, knew very well that Tianyue's intention to sow discord between the sacred palace and the Liwang sect was most likely not true. In Tong Huang's opinion, Tianyue's actions were very likely just as she had said. She just wanted to see who was stronger between Xiaoqin and Tong Huang. It was purely for fun. As the first saintess of the 9 heavens, her status was on par with Xiaoqin and Tong Huang. However, Tianyue was more like a lively little girl. Her style of doing things was completely based on her mood. It was also because everything was based on her mood that Tianyue's style of doing things was very unpredictable. However, her strength was indeed not to be underestimated. Even Tong Huang did not dare to be the slightest bit careless when facing Tianyue. After hearing Tianyue's answer, Tong Huang turned to look at Xiaoqin as if to say, "You saw it yourself. This woman wants the two of us to fight. Don't be fooled by her." Xiaoqin looked at Tianyue and smiled faintly in response to Tong Huang's stare. "Do you think Tong Huang and I will still fight now?" With Tianyue's appearance, would Xiaoqin and Tong Huang still fight? Tianyue's face suddenly revealed a look of boredom when she heard this. "Alright, I guess I'm overthinking. How boring. I originally thought that I would be able to enjoy an earth-shattering battle." She already knew that it would be very difficult for Xiaoqin and Tong Huang to fight in the current situation. After all, Tianyue was at the side. How could the two of them fight? As she spoke, Tianyue seemed to have thought of something very quickly. A bright smile appeared on her face again as she looked at Xiaoqin. However, the sacred palace probably won't give up on this supreme-grade spirit vein, and the Liwang sect obviously won't be willing to give up this supreme-grade spirit vein so easily. In that case, a battle between you and Tong Huang really is unavoidable. Begging for collection, begging for monthly votes, begging for recommendations. End of chapter. Chapter 1067. Tianyue was originally a little unhappy because of Xiaoqin's words, but she soon became excited again. Xiaoqin finally saw the nature of the 9 heaven saintess when he heard Tianyue's words. This was the first time he had seen her provoking someone so openly. Tianyu spoke bluntly in front of Xiao Qin and Tong Huang. Tong Huang's expression turned ugly, while Xiao Qin smiled helplessly. It seems that today's battle is unavoidable. It was as if he did not care about Tianyue's provocation at all. Xiao Qin was still smiling. As soon as Xiao Qin finished speaking, Tong Huang snorted and said, "Tianyue, do you take us for fools?" Tong Huang was very unhappy, while Xiao Qin appeared more indifferent. Tianyu's smile didn't fade when she saw the two's contrasting reactions, but she didn't say anything else. In any case, with this supreme-grade spirit vein here, unless one of them chose to back down, a battle was inevitable. As for Tianyue, she was only here to join in the fun. Whether they fought or not, it would not be a loss for Tianyue. Tong Huang had an impulse to fly into a rage when he saw Tianyu's smile. However, the current situation was a little sensitive. The three first saints were gathered together, and if Tong Huang attacked now, it wouldn't end well. In addition, the Sacred Palace human race had the advantage in terms of strength, because the human race had a saint expert. Although Tong Huang didn't care about the saint expert and could just leave, what about the barbarian race under him? Once the battle started, they might not be able to leave. Moreover, Tianyu and Xiao Qin didn't know about the supreme-grade spirit vein. The Liwang sect had already planned to give it up long ago. They had originally planned to mine as much as they could before the Sacred Palace took it back and then destroy it. However, it wasn't impossible to return it to the Sacred Palace if there were any unforeseen circumstances. Although the spirit vein was a supreme-grade spirit vein, it wasn't to the point where they couldn't give it up. Therefore, Tong Huang didn't think it was worth it to go to war with the Sacred Palace over a supreme-grade spirit vein. Of course, if it weren't for Tianyu, Tong Huang might have still competed with Xiao Qin. However, with Tianyu at the side and all this started by her, Tong Huang didn't have any plans to fight with Xiao Qin. Tong Huang suppressed the anger in his heart. Soon, he smiled again and said to Xiao Qin, "If the Sacred Palace wants this supreme-grade spirit vein, then the Liwang sect will give it to you." Tong Huang was very decisive. He gave up on a supreme-grade spirit vein just like that. Tianyu curled her lips in displeasure when she heard this. She seemed to have expected Tong Huang to do this. As the first chosen of the Liwang sect, it would be abnormal if Tong Huang didn't have such magnanimity. Even though a supreme-grade spirit vein was precious, Tong Huang was willing to give it up just like that. Tong Huang voluntarily gave up on the supreme-grade spirit vein. He then looked at Xiao Qin, clearly waiting for Xiao Qin's reply. Xiao Qin was a little surprised when he saw this. According to Xiao Qin's thinking, Tong Huang wouldn't give up on the supreme-grade spirit vein so easily. Therefore, there was likely to be a battle between the two sides. However, who would arrive first? Tong Huang had chosen to give it up so easily. I really can't be careless when facing the first chosen of the Northern Star boundary like Tong Huang, Xiao Qin thought to himself. Xiao Qin didn't think that Tong Huang was afraid of him or the Sacred Palace when he gave up on the supreme-grade spirit vein. On the contrary, the fact that Tong Huang gave up on the supreme-grade spirit vein so easily showed Tong Huang's decisiveness. In the face of benefits and gains, Tong Huang had decisively chosen the best path. It was just a supreme-grade spirit vein, so be it. This was the magnanimity that Tong Huang displayed as the first chosen of the Liwang sect. Tong Huang's decision was both surprising and admirable. Xiao Qin smiled faintly under Tong Huang's gaze. Chosen Tong Huang is really straightforward. Since that's the case, I thank you on behalf of the Sacred Palace. Since Tong Huang had chosen to give up, Xiao Qin naturally had no reason to refuse. Upon hearing Xiao Qin's words, Tong Huang smiled, but his smile was a little cold. He stared at Xiao Qin and said word by word, "Xiao Qin, don't be too happy." Xiao Qin, it's too early to be happy. A supreme-grade spiritual vein may be precious, but it's nothing to the Sacred Palace or the Power King's sect. I know that the Sacred Palace wants to take back the resources in the territory of the human race, but whether you can succeed is another matter altogether. The next time we meet, I think we'll have to fight. I hope you won't disappoint me. A supreme-grade spirit vein was nothing to the Sacred Palace or the Liwang sect. Furthermore, if the Sacred Palace wanted to take back the various resources in the human race's territory, they would inevitably become enemies with the Liwang sect and other quasi-saint sects. When that time came, the outcome would probably not be the same as today. Upon hearing Tong Huang's words, Xiao Chen also knew that such a day would definitely come, and it wouldn't be too far away. Xiao Chen smiled faintly and said, "Chosen Tong Huang, I'll wait for you then. In that case, holy son of Tong Emperor, just wait and see. I believe that I will not disappoint you the next time we meet." Haha, good. There will be plenty of time in the future. Upon hearing this, Tong Huang laughed heartily, then turned to look at Wang Zhong, who was not far away. Upon seeing this, Wang Zhong took out a voice transmission talisman. Soon, a starship belonging to the Liwang sect rose into the air from the small city nearby. Immediately, the many barbarians present quickly boarded the starship. With Tong Huang's decision, the barbarians did not have the slightest reluctance and readily gave up on the supreme-grade spirit vein. As the barbarians left on the starship in satisfaction, the hundreds of thousands of human race slaves below burst into cheers. Leaving in satisfaction meant that they were finally free. However, Xiao Chen did not pay any attention to them. Instead, he turned his gaze to Tianyu and said with a smile on his face, "Saintess Tianyu, it seems that today's show is destined to end." Haha, it doesn't matter. In Tong Huang's words, there will be plenty of time in the future. Tianyu smiled faintly. Since Tong Huang had left, there was naturally no good show to watch. Upon seeing this, Xiao Chen also smiled. Yes, there will be plenty of time in the future. However, I'm afraid that in the future, Saintess Tian, you will no longer be a spectator. Perhaps there will also be a battle between you and me. The Sacred Palace wanted to take back the many resources in the human race territory, and these resources were basically controlled by the 6 quasi-saint sects. In this way, not only would they have to face the Liwang sect, but 9 heavens would also be one of the Sacred Palace's opponents. Upon hearing Xiao Chen's words, Tianyu smiled and said, "Then I'll have to ask chosen Xiao Chen to show mercy. Begging for your collection, begging for monthly votes, begging for recommendations." End of chapter. Chapter 1068. Tong Huang simply gave up on the supreme-grade spirit vein. With Tong Huang and the Liwang sect's departure, Xiao Chen and Tianyu naturally had nothing much to say. The two exchanged a few perfunctory words before Tianyu left with the Tian clan girl beside her. They successfully took back the supreme-grade spirit vein. Of course, Xiao Chen wasn't too excited about this because this was just the beginning. Moreover, Tianyu had played a huge role in Tong Huang's decisiveness. If Tianyu hadn't shown up, Tong Huang might have really fought. But all in all, the ending was good. Although more than half of this supreme-grade spirit vein had been mined by the Power King sect, and there was not much left to be mined, it was better than nothing. After all, even mosquitoes were meat. Moreover, being able to take back the supreme-grade spirit vein was more of a symbolic meaning. It had an effect of establishing prestige for the other quasi-saint sects and also announcing to them that the Sacred Palace's rise wasn't just in fame, but also in taking back what originally belonged to the human race. With Tong Huang and Tianyu's departure, Xiao Chen turned to look at the crowd and began to instruct them to take over the supreme-grade spirit vein. Xiao Chen didn't bring many people with him because he was mainly here to find Qin Shi. Xiao Chen's plan was very simple. Baimo Xingzong would temporarily take care of the supreme-grade spirit vein and suspend all mining until the Sacred Palace sent people over. Of course, with Baimo Xingzong temporarily taking care of the spirit vein, Xiao Chen would definitely leave someone from the Sacred Palace to take care of it. After thinking for a while, Xiao Chen finally decided to let Huang Fu Ao stay behind. Huang Fu-ao was the sacred palace's candidate chosen, so it was more than enough for him to stay behind and guard the place. Moreover, this was only temporary. Once he returned to the sacred palace, they would definitely send someone to take care of the supreme-grade spirit vein. Therefore, Huang Fu-ao would only stay behind temporarily and could return to the sacred palace very soon. After giving out these instructions, the next step was to deal with the human race slaves present. There were many of them, and they were all forcibly captured by the barbarian race. Now that the sacred palace had taken over the supreme-grade spirit vein, they naturally couldn't be treated as slaves anymore. However, the operation of a supreme-grade spirit vein naturally required a lot of labor. In the beginning, Sect Master Baimo Xingzong actually suggested that the sacred palace do what the Liwang sect did and search for other races in the Baimo continent and capture them as slaves. However, Xiao Chen rejected this suggestion without even thinking about it. After thinking about it carefully, Xiao Chen finally decided to dismiss the human race slaves and let them return to their hometowns. Those who were already homeless could temporarily stay here and be taken care of by the sacred palace. At the same time, the sacred palace would invite them to continue mining the supreme-grade spirit vein through recruitment. Although they were doing the same kind of work before and after, the actual situation was completely different. Previously, the human race slaves were not only burdensome with tasks, they didn't even have food to eat. However, according to Xiao Chen's idea, the sacred palace would pay them a corresponding remuneration if they continued mining the spirit vein. Moreover, the sacred palace would also be responsible for their basic necessities. The treatment could be said to be worlds apart. After coming up with a way to settle the human race slaves, Xiao Chen roughly explained his idea to the human race slaves. Everyone was stunned when they heard Xiao Chen's words. In fact, they were indeed very nervous just now. After all, many of them had been captured here for several years. If they were allowed to return to their hometowns now, they didn't even know where else to go. However, since Xiao Chen was willing to keep them and hire them to continue mining the spirit vein, not only would they get revenge, but they would also be provided with food and a place to stay. For a moment, everyone cheered. For ordinary people without cultivation, their requirements were really not high. It was enough to be able to eat their fill and wear warm clothes. They didn't have many other ideas like cultivators. Ordinary humans lived at most 100 years in their lives, so they didn't have many requirements. Hearing the cheers below, Xiao Chen nodded slightly. He then specially called Chen Zhong over and gave him some instructions alone. Chen Zhong, I'll leave this place to you during this period. Get familiar with them and try to appease their emotions. If you need anything, feel free to mention it to Huang Fu. He will do his best to satisfy you. When the sacred palace sends someone over, we will discuss other details with you. At that time, those who want to stay can stay, and those who want to leave, I will let them go. When he heard Xiao Chen's words, Chen Zhong nodded gratefully and replied, Lord Chosen, don't worry. I will definitely take good care of them. Chen Zhong's worship for Xiao Chen was close to blind. After making arrangements for the supreme-grade spirit vein and staying for a day, Xiao Chen and the others left early the next morning and returned to Baimo Xingzong. They then boarded a spaceship and rushed back to the sacred palace. Almost half a month later, Xiao Chen and the others returned to the sacred palace. The first thing they did was naturally to bring Qin Shuru to pay respects to Bai Ruiyue and Xiao Qing. It should be known that Bai Ruiyue was extremely worried when Qin Shuru went missing. She came over almost every day to ask about Qin Shuru's situation. Now that Qin Shuru had returned safely, Xiao Chen naturally had to let Bai Ruiyue know. After greeting Bai Ruiyue and Xiao Qing with the three girls, they chatted for a while before a dustless sacred hall elder found Xiao Chen and informed him that the ancestors had invited Xiao Chen to the main hall for a meeting. Xiao Xing and the others came to look for him. Xiao Chen did not delay and left Qin Shuru and the girls with Bai Ruiyue so that they could accompany their parents. As for himself, he rushed to the main hall on the main peak of the sacred palace. When Shao Chen arrived at the main hall, Chun Ling, Long Qing, Chun Yu and the other chosen and saintesses, as well as the 4 ancestors including Shao Xing, and a total of 46 Saint Venerables were all present. Such a lineup could be said to include the true upper echelons of the entire sacred palace. Since everyone was gathered here, it was obvious that the meeting today was very important to the sacred palace. Otherwise, it would be impossible for everyone to be gathered here. Shao Chen was the last to arrive. Everyone was waiting for him. Seeing Shao Chen stride over, Shao Xing smiled and pointed to Shao Chen's seat. After Shao Chen took his seat, Shao Xing said with a smile, "All right, chosen Shao Chen is also here. Let's begin." Shao Chen had not been in the sacred palace during this period, so he did not know what had happened in the sacred palace. Therefore, after hearing Shao Xing's words, Shao Chen looked at Chun Ling and Long Qing in confusion. He wanted to know what was going to be discussed today. Begging for collection, begging for monthly votes, begging for recommendations. End of chapter. Chapter 1069. The entire upper echelon of the sacred palace was gathered today, but Shao Chen had no idea what they were going to discuss. As soon as Shao Chen returned to the Holy Palace, he had only exchanged a few words with Bai Ruiyue before he was summoned by Shao Xing. Therefore, Shao Chen was completely clueless about what they were going to discuss next and knew nothing about it. He looked at Chun Ling and Long Qing for help, hoping that they could remind him. However, before the two of them could speak, Shao Xing had already said indifferently from the main seat, "Everyone, the sacred palace has just been established, but after this period of time, it has basically stabilized. However, we can't let our guard down because the real test that the sacred palace has to face is coming up next." The sacred palace had only been established for a few years. For a colossus like the sacred palace, a few years was nothing more than the snap of a finger. However, after a few years of hard work, the sacred palace was still considered stable. Without keeping them in suspense, Shao Chen soon learned the purpose of this meeting from Shao Xing. Shao Chen did not expect that this meeting would be about the ownership of the human race's territory and various resources. He had just seized a supreme-grade spirit vein from the BMO continent, and today, Shao Xing had gathered everyone to discuss this issue. It had to be said that he was really efficient. He bluntly explained the matter to everyone, but there was not the slightest change in their expressions. It was obvious that they had already known about it beforehand. This was very normal. As the internal components of the sacred palace stabilized, it was naturally time to shift their focus to the outside world. As for the first problem to bear the brunt, it was naturally the allocation of the human race's territory and resources. These were the most critical issues. However, these 2 points were also the most contradictory because they were related to benefit. After a slight pause, Shao Xing's originally serious face suddenly revealed a smile. "Speaking of which, I can tell you a piece of good news. Not long ago, chosen Shao Chen successfully seized a supreme-grade spirit vein from the Liwang sect." Shao Xing and the others were obviously already aware of what had happened on the BMO continent. Shao Xing and the other 4 patriarchs were naturally very satisfied with Shao Chen's performance. Being able to seize a supreme-grade spirit vein from the hands of the Liwang sect's first chosen, Tong Huang, had indeed greatly increased the sacred palace's momentum. As Shao Xing's words faded, everyone present turned to look at Shao Chen. Faced with everyone's gazes, Shao Chen calmly stood up, cupped his hands and bowed to the crowd. "I was just lucky." Shao Chen's attitude was calm. Seeing this, Shao Xing smiled and said, "All right, the BMO continent's matter is worth being happy about. This is a good start. However, a mere supreme-grade spirit vein is obviously not enough to support the entire sacred palace. Therefore, if our sacred palace wants to truly gain a foothold in the North Star boundary, we must seize back the resources that originally belonged to the human race. It had been a very long time since the human race's status had become lower and lower due to the lack of a quasi-saint sect. As their status continued to decline, the human race's territory in the entire North Star boundary was also constantly shrinking. To make a simple analogy, perhaps thousands of years ago, the territories that still belonged to the human race had long been seized by other races. The continent that should have been dominated by the human race had been snatched away by other races, and the human race could only live under the charity of others and suffer in silence. The continuous loss of territory brought about harm, and that was the reduction of the resources in their hands. Those precious resources were gradually taken away by other races, resulting in the human race having a pitifully small amount of resources in their hands today. In fact, during this period of time, Xiao Chen had paid almost no attention to other matters because of Qin Shuru's disappearance, so he only had a rough understanding of the current situation in the sacred palace. First and most importantly, after a few months, the number of human race forces under the sacred palace's name that had declared their allegiance to the sacred palace had reached dozens. With these human race forces' allegiance, Xiao Xing and the other patriarchs began to understand the details of the North Star boundary from these human race forces. It would have been fine if they didn't know, but once they did, Xiao Xing and the other patriarchs were secretly shocked. The human race's situation in the North Star boundary was worse than they had imagined. First, there was the issue of territory. There were only 3 continents like the Bi-Mo continent that were truly dominated by the human race in the entire North Star boundary, and they were all insignificant small continents. The largest one was only slightly larger than the Tianqian continent. The seemingly prosperous human race only occupied 3 continents in the North Star boundary. It was easy to imagine how weak the human race was. Most of the human race were living under the charity of others and under the tyranny of other races, just like the Fallen River sacred sect on the Taishan continent. Although they had settled down on the Taishan continent, they couldn't make any decisions and could only linger on while at death's door. Their territory was pitifully small, not to mention their resources. Almost all of them had been snatched away, and they only had some worthless low-grade spiritual veins in their hands. Low-grade spiritual veins could be said to be of little value, but of course it was better than nothing. However, the entire human race only had low-grade spiritual veins in their hand. They didn't even have a single mid-grade spiritual vein, as all of them had been taken away by other races. Without resources, it was impossible to become stronger. After all, even the cleverest housewife could not cook without rice. Even if one was more talented than the heavens, if one did not have the corresponding resources to support them, they would only end up being annihilated in the end. Territory and resources could be said to have been completely taken away by other races. After truly understanding the human race's situation in the North Star boundary, Xiao Xing and the other patriarchs unanimously agreed that they had to change this situation. They had to take back the territory and resources that once belonged to the human race because these 2 things were the roots of the human race, and also the roots of the sacred palace. Without territory and resources, the sacred palace was like a rootless duckweed, a complete mirage without any foundation to speak of. They had to raise the status of the human race in the North Star boundary and take back more territory and resources. Only then could the sacred palace and the entire human race truly gain a firm foothold in the North Star boundary. This was something that had already been decided, and no one could change it. In the end, Xiao Xing said in a deep voice, "We have to take back the territory and resources that once belonged to the human race. In this way, we will inevitably become enemies with the other quasi-saint sects, but this can't be helped. The sacred palace needs these things, and the human race needs them even more. Therefore, I've gathered everyone here today to prepare for any possible conflicts that may break out next." begging for collection, begging for monthly votes, begging for recommendations. End of chapter. Chapter 1070. The sacred palace needed to seize more territory and resources in order to gain more authority. This would inevitably lead to conflict with the other quasi-saint sections. Shao Xing did not use the word war here, but conflict. That's right, the sacred palace did not want to start a war with the other quasi-saint sects right now, which was why Shao Xing used the word conflict. To put it bluntly, a conflict was a battle within a controllable range. Once it escalated to the level of a war, things would obviously become uncontrollable. Whether it was the sacred palace or the other 6 quasi-saint sects, none of them would want a war to break out. To seize resources, they naturally had to have a plan. Moreover, the sacred palace's strength was clearly not enough to contend against all 6 quasi-saint sects at the same time. Therefore, the sacred palace needed to rope in some of them and attack some of them. According to Shao Xing and the other 4 patriarchs' plan, the sacred palace would take the initiative to seize back some of the territory and resources that originally belonged to the human race. Their first target would be the Night Ghost Pavilion. This was because the Night Ghost Pavilion occupied the most territory of the human race and had seized the most resources. If they could take these things back from the Night Ghost Pavilion, it would definitely be an indescribable benefit for the sacred palace. Their main target was the Night Ghost Pavilion. No one else in the room objected to this, and this was quickly confirmed. After deciding on their target, the next step was to appease the other quasi-saint sections. According to Shao Xing and the other 4 patriarchs, they could try to rope in the Supreme Saint sect, Li Wang sect, and 9 heavens. First of all, the Supreme Saint sect and the Sacred Palace were relatively familiar with each other. Moreover, the 2 sides had cooperated in the Sky Expanse sect's secret domain. Although this cooperation was fake and everyone knew this, it was indeed an opportunity. Therefore, the Supreme Saint sect could try to rope them in. As for the Li Wang sect and 9 heavens, they did not have much of the human race's territory and resources in their hands. Therefore, the Sacred Palace's actions would not have much of an impact on them. This was perhaps one of the reasons why Tong Huang had given up on the supreme grade spirit vein on the 100 Mo continent so easily. After all, the Li Wang sect did not rely on it for a living. In the hands of the Li Wang sect, the human race's territory and resources were nothing. They only occupied an extremely small portion, so it would not be a big deal even if they returned all of it to the human race. The 3 great sects could be roped in, and if they succeeded, the 4 sects could form a temporary alliance. At that time, the Sacred Palace would not have to face the Night Ghost Pavilion, Sky Demon, and Thousand Beast Valley. Of course, the Sacred Palace did not have full confidence in allying with the 3 great sections. Take 9 heavens for example. Shao Xing and the other 4 patriarchs felt that the chances were slim. This was because the divine race rarely allied with other races. They were simply too arrogant. Even so, even if they only managed to rope in the Supreme Saint sect and Li Wang sect, it would be considered a success for the Sacred Palace. The 4 patriarchs had already formulated a detailed plan in their hearts. After listening to Shao Xing's words, everyone exchanged glances. The Qing Emperor was the first to speak. Patriarch, this way, the situation in the North Star boundary will most likely change greatly. The 7 great sects are likely to be divided into 2 different camps. When that time comes, the Azure Arch didn't finish his words, but everyone present understood what he meant. Once the Sacred Palace did this, it would probably be difficult for the North Star realm to remain calm. The relationship between the 7 quasi-saint sects would also become increasingly tense, and a war would break out at any moment. Just think about it. If the Sacred Palace, Supreme Divinity Sect, Power King Sect, and 9 heavens had formed an alliance, regardless of whether it was true or not, once news of this spread, the Night Ghost Pavilion, Sky Demon Sect, and myriad beasts valley would definitely join forces as well. At that time, the situation would be difficult to predict. The Qing emperor was a little worried, but soon after, Chen Yu said lazily, "I'm afraid the situation in the North Star boundary has already changed since the establishment of the sacred palace. Even if we don't do this, there will be a war between the 7 great sects sooner or later." The other chosens all nodded in agreement with Chen Yu's lazy expression. The rise of the sacred palace had indeed unknowingly changed the situation in the North Star boundary. The most fundamental reason why the 7 great sects were able to restrain each other in the past few years was because the rise of the sacred palace had yet to touch the interests of the other sections. But it was different now. Since the sacred palace had appeared, they would have to fight for their own interests. As a result, there was no doubt that disputes would break out. The war with the other great sects would definitely come. It was just a matter of whether it would come sooner or later. If they gave up their own interests because they were afraid of fighting with the other great sects, then there would be no need to establish the sacred palace. The 10 great chosen nodded in agreement with Shao Xing and the other patriarchs' plan. Soon after, the holy sovereigns also nodded in agreement. Seeing that everyone nodded, the Burning Lamp Patriarch, who had been silent all this time, said in a deep voice, "Since everyone agrees, then it's decided. The Night Ghost Pavilion is our target. In addition, send people to the Supreme Divine Sect, Liwang Sect, and 9 Heavens. Think of a way to befriend and rope them in." The Burning Lamp Patriarch's words represented that the sacred palace had truly taken the most crucial step to establish a foothold in the North Star boundary. It was also the first step. However, this step was filled with endless danger because it was bound to be retaliated by the other quasi-sage sections. His voice echoed in the hall. Hearing this, everyone nodded in agreement. However, after the final decision was made, Shao Chen, who had been silent all this time, looked indifferently at Shao Xing and the other patriarchs. "Patriarch, since this has been decided, we should also show some more strength. I'm afraid that just 2 quasi-saint supreme venerables aren't enough to make the Supreme Divine Sect, Liwang Sect, and 9 Heavens Pavilion think highly of us. Since they wanted to compete with the other great sects for interests, the strength that the sacred palace had shown now was probably not enough. One had to know that to the outside world, the sacred palace only had 2 quasi-saint supreme venerables. They were Shao Xing and Mengjie. Moreover, their cultivation was only at the initial quasi-saint level. Such strength was indeed very difficult to make the Supreme Divine Sect, Liwang Sect, and 9 Heavens think highly of them. After all, 2 initial quasi-saint supreme venerables were nothing in their eyes. Therefore, it was very difficult for them to make up their minds to form an alliance with the sacred palace. After all, the sacred palace was too weak, so there was naturally no need to form an alliance. Therefore, since the decision had been made, it was time to show a little more of the sacred palace's strength to the outside world to increase the sacred palace's status in the hearts of the world. Begging for collection, begging for monthly votes, begging for recommendations. End of chapter. Chapter 1071. Upon hearing Shao Chen's words, everyone present nodded in agreement. Indeed, the strength displayed by the sacred palace was still too weak compared to the other quasi-saint sections. Although the 2 beginner quasi-saint great venerables were enough to make the other 6 quasi-saint sects wary, it wasn't enough for them to take them seriously. Therefore, it was necessary for them to display more strength. Shao Xing and the others nodded slightly. Then, Shao Xing said in a deep voice, "That's right. Mengjie and I alone aren't enough. Since that's the case, it's time for Bing Lian and Dipankara to appear." For a long time, the sacred palace had only shown 2 quasi-saint great venerables to the outside world, and the world had always thought that the sacred palace only had 2 quasi-saint great venerables. However, with the appearance of Dipankara and Bing Lian, the number of quasi-saint great venerables in the sacred palace had doubled to 4. 4 quasi-saint great venerables was probably enough to shock the other 6 quasi-saint sections. After making a decision, Shao Xing and the other 3 great venerables quickly ordered everyone to make preparations. They believed that they would receive an order in a few days. The general plan had been set. Their first target was the Night Ghost Pavilion. At the same time, they would find a way to rope in the Supreme Deity sect, Li Wang sect, and 9 heavens. Everyone left the hall. Shao Chun, Chun Ling, and Long Qing walked side by side. It was at this moment that Chen Yu caught up with the 3 of them and smiled at Shao Chun. "Junior brother Shao Chun, let's have a drink together. We haven't had a drink together in a long time." Shao Chun didn't refuse Chen Yu's invitation and nodded. Then, Shao Chun, Chun Ling, Long Qing, Chen Yu, Emperor Qing, Jiang Yu, and the others went to have a drink together. There was a city in the sacred region called the Sacred City. Naturally, there was a restaurant in this city. They asked for a private room and sat down. Then, they started chatting while drinking. The wine here was brewed by the Sacred Palace and was very delicious. Of course, the person in charge of this restaurant was also a deacon of the Sacred Palace. After taking a sip of the fine wine in his cup, Shao Chen looked at Chen Yu and said with a smile, "Senior brother Chen Yu, what brings you to treat me to a drink today?" "Haha, it's been a long time since I last got together with junior brother. It's a rare opportunity, so I naturally have to get drunk." Hearing this, Chen Yu raised his cup and smiled. Compared to the other chosens and saintesses, Chen Yu had kept a very low profile over the past few years, even though he had become the 10th chosen and controlled the ethereal sacred hall after the establishment of the sacred palace. It could be said that in the eyes of outsiders, Chen Yu and his ethereal sacred hall were the most obscure of the 10 sacred halls in the sacred palace. Of course, this was also because of Chen Yu's personality. He was very lazy and avoided the missions of the sacred palace as much as possible. Therefore, after a few years, there were no news of Chen Yu's deeds, so he naturally became a nobody. Of course, Chen Yu didn't care about this, but everyone present knew that Chen Yu and his ethereal sacred hall were not to be underestimated, especially Chen Yu. Even Shao Chen didn't know how strong Chen Yu was. It was just a simple invitation for a drink. Hearing this, Shao Chen smiled bitterly. This was really the Chen Yu that he had always known. Now that everyone was preparing for the upcoming battle, Chen Yu was still in the mood to invite them for a drink. Shao Chen smiled helplessly but didn't say anything. Everyone drank in the sacred city until late at night before returning to their respective sacred palaces. In the next few days, Shao Chen accompanied Qin Shuru, his daughters, and his parent. Of course, Shao Chen also told them about the sacred palace's next move. The 3 girls were shocked when they heard that the sacred palace was going to attack the Night Ghost Pavilion. One had to know that the sacred palace's actions this time would definitely infuriate the Night Ghost Pavilion. After all, the Night Ghost Pavilion had a lot of territory and resources that originally belonged to the human race. It was obviously impossible for the Night Ghost Pavilion to give up on these things. As such, they could only fight. After all, the Sacred Palace's target wasn't just a certain continent or a certain resource, but all the territory and resources that once belonged to the human race in the Night Ghost Pavilion's hands. As a result, the Night Ghost Pavilion would naturally suffer heavy losses. It was obvious that the Night Ghost Pavilion wouldn't give up without a fight. The North Star Domain was about to fall into chaos. With the development of the Sacred Palace and the changes in the situation, things had finally reached this stage. For several days, the Sacred Palace began to prepare for their operation against the Night Ghost Pavilion. Sacred Palace experts were sent out one after another. At the same time, spaceships were constantly being built, and similar pills and talismans were being produced as quickly as possible. The Sacred Palace's various actions naturally didn't escape the eyes of the other quasi-saint sections. Very soon, the other 6 quasi-saint sects also noticed the Sacred Palace's movements. At this moment, in the Supreme God sect of the Taishan continent, Yadun stood in his cave dwelling and looked at the distant horizon with a faintly discernible smile on his face. So it's coming. It's faster than I expected. After learning of the Sacred Palace's actions, Yadun didn't need to think to know what the Sacred Palace wanted to do. Back when the Sacred Palace had risen, Yadun had already known that there would be great chaos in the North Star domain sooner or later. This was because the Sacred Palace had to seize the North Star domain's resources. As a result, there was bound to be a chaotic battle between the 7 quasi-saint sections. There would only be 2 results in this chaotic battle. Either the Sacred Palace would obtain enough resources, or the Sacred Palace would be destroyed. The Sacred Palace had already begun to sharpen their blades, but no one knew who the Sacred Palace would choose as their first target. Yadun realized that a great war was coming. At the same time, the other quasi-saint sects, the Night Ghost Pavilion, the Liwang sect, the 9 Heavens, the Demonic Sky Hall, and the Myriad Beast Valley had also realized this. At the same time, on the Evernight continent where the Night Ghost Pavilion was located, a beautiful woman in red stood proudly on a black mountain peak. There was a faint smile on her lips as she looked in the direction of the Sacred Palace and sneered. Is the Sacred Palace finally going to redistribute the North Star domain's resources? This beautiful woman was one of the quasi-saint supreme sovereigns of the Night Ghost Pavilion, Supreme Sovereign Blood Moon. Xiao Chen had met Supreme Sovereign Blood Moon before. As she spoke, a cold light flashed in her eyes. In truth, the Night Ghost Pavilion had long been prepared for this situation. After all, the Night Ghost Pavilion had foreseen the sudden rise of the Sacred Palace from the beginning. A quasi-saint sect couldn't always live up to its reputation. The Sacred Palace's rise was very strong, but it didn't have many resources in its hands. As a result, the Sacred Palace was naturally unwilling to accept this. Therefore, it was imperative that the North Star domain's resources be redistributed. Begging for collection, begging for monthly votes, begging for recommendations. End of chapter. Chapter 1072. The Sacred Palace's actions naturally couldn't be hidden from the eyes of the world. Of course, the Sacred Palace had never thought of hiding it because such a thing couldn't be hidden at all. Following the Sacred Palace's various actions, the world knew that the Sacred Palace intended to seize the resources of the North Star boundary. Following the Sacred Palace's actions, the resources of the North Star boundary were obviously going to be reshuffled. Starships, pills, talismans, and other necessities were urgently being manufactured. These were all necessary things for war. After experiencing the war with the North Demon Continent, the Sacred Palace was no stranger to war, especially the higher-ups of the Sacred Palace. For example, the 4 old ancestors such as Xiao Xing, the chosen such as Xiao Qin, and the various sacred venerables were all people who had experienced the cruel flames of war. Countless pairs of eyes stared intently at the Sacred Palace's every move. At the same time, on the distant 9 Heavens continent, which was the continent controlled by 9 Heavens, on a beautiful mountain peak. The peak wasn't big, but it was filled with the fragrance of flowers and birds. In a cave on the mountain peak, Tian Yu was holding a good-looking rabbit in her arms and grooming its fur out of boredom. Beside Tian Yu, a 9 Heavens disciple stood to the side and asked curiously, "Senior sister, do you think the Sacred Palace really dares to snatch food from the tiger's mouth?" What the Sacred Palace was planning to do was no longer a secret, so the 9 Heavens disciple was also very curious. Did the Sacred Palace really dare to snatch food from the tiger's mouth? One must know that if the Sacred Palace really dared to do so, the 6 quasi-saint sects definitely wouldn't sit idly by. Did the Sacred Palace really have a death wish? Tian Yu smiled faintly when she heard the female disciple's words. The Sacred Palace naturally can't offend all 6 quasi-saint sections. The only thing I'm curious about now is who the Sacred Palace will target. One had to admit that Tian Yu was indeed smart. The sacred palace wanted to snatch the resources of the North Star boundary, and almost all of these resources were in the hands of the 6 quasi-saint sections. In this way, the sacred palace was bound to become enemies with the 6 quasi-saint sections. However, with the strength of the sacred palace, it was naturally impossible to offend 6 quasi-sage sects at the same time. Moreover, it was impossible for the sacred palace to do so. Therefore, it was very normal to rope in some and attack some. It was just that no one knew who the sacred palace would target. Faced with Tian Yu's words, the female disciple nodded her head in confusion. Tian Yu had no intention of explaining further. She suddenly thought of Xiao Qin, the first chosen of the sacred palace. The smile on her face became a little brighter. Tian Yu thought to herself. Xiao Qin, I wonder if your sacred palace can truly stand at the top of the North Star boundary this time, and truly sit on equal footing with our 6 quasi-sage sections. The rise of the sacred palace seemed to have made them the 7th great quasi-saint sect in the North Star boundary, but in essence, there was still a gap between the sacred palace and the 6 great quasi-saint sections. They were not truly at the top of the North Star boundary. The reason was very simple. The sacred palace had just been established and its foundation was too shallow. It did not have any decent resources or territory. The sacred palace was like a rootless duckweed that could not withstand a single blow. To put it bluntly, the sacred palace's operation this time was not a matter of whether they dared to or not, but because they had no choice. The sacred palace had to do this. Otherwise, only destruction would await the sacred palace. The sacred palace had to do this. In other words, this was a problem that every sect had to face at the beginning of its establishment. If they could break through, the world would be vast, but if they could not, only destruction would await. Tian Yu suddenly thought of Xiao Qin. While Tian Yu suddenly thought of Xiao Qin, the 3 siblings, Xiao Qin, Qin Ling, and Long Qing, were also summoned to the main hall by Xiao Xing. This time, only Xiao Xing and the other 3 patriarchs were in the main hall. Looking at the 3 siblings, Xiao Xing, who was the leader, said with a smile, I plan to send the 3 of you to the Supreme Deity sect, Liwang sect, and 9 halls respectively. Xiao Xing didn't beat around the bush and went straight to the point. The entire sacred palace was preparing for this war, but before that, they naturally needed to send people to the Heavenly Saint sect, the Power King sect, and the 9th Heaven sect. The status of the people sent this time naturally could not be too low. Otherwise, the sacred palace would appear insincere. After much consideration, Xiao Xing and the others finally decided to send Xiao Qin and his siblings. First of all, Xiao Qin and his siblings were chosen of the sacred palace. Their status was definitely enough. Moreover, if anything happened during their trip to the 3 sects, the 3 of them would be able to make a prompt decision and make their own decisions. Xiao Qin and his siblings did not hesitate too much when they heard Xiao Xing's words. After exchanging a glance, the 3 of them cupped their hands together and said, Yes. The purpose of going to the Supreme Deity sect and the other 2 quasi-saint sects was self-evident. It was naturally to form an alliance. Of course, the sacred palace would also have to pay a certain price. As for what price, it would depend on the situation at the time. Seeing Xiao Qin and his siblings nod, Ancestor Ice Lotus said nonchalantly, This time, each of you will bring 5 saint sovereigns with you. Firstly, to ensure your safety, and secondly, to protect the sacred palace's reputation. After some simple instructions, Xiao Qin and his siblings left the main hall and walked side by side. Xiao Qin looked at Qin Ling and Long Qing with a smile. Big brother, second sister, how should we split it? Who will go to the Supreme Deity sect? Who will go to the Liwang sect? And who will go to the Night Ghost Pavilion? The 3 of them headed to the 3 quasi-sage sects separately. Naturally, it was impossible for them to travel together. Upon hearing Xiao Qin's words, Long Qing said without hesitation, I'm going to the Supreme Divine sect. Hearing Long Qing's words, Chun Ling immediately said, "Then I'll go to the Power King sect. Supreme Deity sect, Li Wang sect." Xiao Chun smiled bitterly and said, "Then I'm only left with Ninth Heaven? Supreme Deity sect, Li Wang sect, and Ninth Heaven. If one were to say which of the three quasi-saint sects was the most difficult, it would undoubtedly be Ninth Heaven. The reason was very simple. Because of the Sky Race's arrogance, it was simply harder than ascending to the heavens to persuade them to form an alliance. Xiao Chen could already imagine the scene of him going to Ninth Heaven. There would naturally be a lot of rolling eyes. Seeing Xiao Chen's helpless smile, Chun Ling smiled and said, "Third brother, between us siblings, you're the most capable. Naturally, it's the capable who do the most work." "That's right, little brother. It's not like you don't know second sister's temper. If I go to Ninth Heaven, things might get out of hand in the end. Therefore, this heavy responsibility can only be handed to you." Both of them spoke clearly and logically. Xiao Chen could only smile bitterly and did not know what else to say. Begging for collection, begging for monthly votes, begging for recommendations. End of chapter. Chapter 1073. After being tricked, Xiao Chen could only go to the most difficult Ninth Heaven. From the beginning, Xiao Xing and the others had planned to ally with the Supreme Divine Sect and the other two quasi-saint sects. Among them, Ninth Heaven had the lowest chance of success. Now, Chun Ling and Long Qing had chosen to go to the Supreme Divine Sect and the Li Wang sect respectively. Only Ninth Heaven was left for Xiao Chen. As such, Xiao Chen naturally had no other choice. With a bitter smile, Xiao Chen looked at Chun Ling and Long Qing and smiled. Forget it, forget it. Big brother and sister, be careful. The one who should be the most careful is you. However, with little brother's ability, a mere Ninth Heaven shouldn't be a problem." Long Qing smiled. Only in front of Xiao Chen would Long Qing reveal such a smile. Otherwise, with the pride of the pure-blood dragon clan, Long Qing wouldn't treat anyone well. In terms of pride, the Heaven clan was far inferior to the pure-blood dragon clan. However, the dragon clan was only a branch of the beast clan after all. Moreover, there were too few of them. After accepting such a heavy responsibility, the three parted ways and began to prepare. Xiao Xing told the three of them to set off as soon as possible, so the three of them also began to prepare. They would set off early the next morning. After returning to the dustless sacred hall, Xiao Chun told Qin Shuru and the other two girls about this. Although the three girls were a bit worried, they didn't stop him. After all, this was a mission given by the four ancestors. Xiao Chen couldn't refuse. However, this time, the three girls wanted to go together, but they were rejected by Xiao Chen. This trip was of great importance. Xiao Chen didn't plan on bringing too many people. He only needed himself and the 5 saint sovereigns. As for the others, he wouldn't bring anyone, including Qin Shuru and the other two girls. The three women were naturally unwilling to accept Xiao Chen's decision, but seeing Xiao Chen's firm attitude, the three women couldn't say anything more. They understood Xiao Chen's character very well. They knew that Xiao Chen had already made up his mind and would definitely not take them along. After paying his respects to Xiao Qing and Bai Riyue and informing them that he would be leaving for a few days, Xiao Chen led the 5 sacred palace Saint Venerables to the 9 Heavens continent the next morning. There were only 6 people on a small spaceship, including Xiao Chen. However, the 5 sacred venerates accompanying Xiao Chen were all very familiar with Xiao Chen. Needless to say, the 9 Heavens Saint, the Heavenly Pill Saint, and the Pill Cloud Saint were all people that Xiao Chen had known since his time on the Heavenly Chen continent. Moreover, the Heavenly Pill Saint was Xiao Chen's master. In addition to the 3 of them, the other 2 were the Qingju Saint and the Tianfeng Saint. These 2 were no strangers to Xiao Chen. Everyone was very familiar with each other, so there was naturally no awkwardness. Along the way, the 6 of them either cultivated or met up to drink and chat. After so many years of interacting with the saints, Xiao Chen no longer felt the slightest pressure and appeared very relaxed. Just like Xiao Chen, Chun Ling and Long Qing also left at the same time. The three of them headed to the three great sects separately. This time, whether the three of them could convince the three great quasi-saint sects was very important to the Sacred Palace. After all, the Sacred Palace had not reached the point where it could fight against the other 6 quasi-saint sects at the same time with its own strength. In the starry sky, it had already been 10 days since they set off from the Sacred Palace. However, the Sacred Palace was extremely far from the Nine Heavens continent, so it would take them at least 20 days to arrive. Therefore, Xiao Chen and the others were only halfway there. On this day, Xiao Chen's group of 6 sat together, drinking wine while discussing the Nine Heavens Saint. The Nine Heavens Saint looked at Xiao Chen with a hint of worry between his brows. Xiao Chen, the difficulty of this trip is probably not low. Do you have any plans? Everyone knew that the difficulty of this trip was definitely not low. Hearing the Nine Heavens Saint's words, Xiao Chen took a sip of wine and said somewhat helplessly, I know that the Sky Race's arrogance is well known in the entire North Star boundary, but I have never come into contact with the Sky Race and don't have any specific plans now. We can only take one step at a time. None of them had come into contact with the Sky Race, so it was indeed a little too early to talk about any plans now. They could only take one step at a time. Hearing Xiao Chen's words, the Nine Heavens Saint and the others nodded slightly. That was all they could do. There was no good plan. For the next 10 days, Xiao Chen and the others hurried on without rest. After rushing at full speed, Xiao Chen and the others finally arrived at the Nine Heavens continent where the Nine Heavens continent was located. If the Heavenly Chen continent was to the east of the North Star boundary, then the Nine Heavens continent would be to the south of the North Star boundary. The two were in two completely different directions. Standing on the deck of the starship and looking at the enormous continent in front of them, the continent's surface area wasn't any smaller than the Great God continent. However, it was different from the Great God continent. The inhabitants of the Nine Heavens continent were all Sky Race. Outsiders were not allowed to live on the Nine Heavens continent for long. This was the rule of the Nine Heavens continent because in the eyes of the Sky Race, living on the same continent as outsiders was an extremely shameful thing. This was a race that believed that their bloodline was the noblest. Not only did they not allow outsiders to live on the Nine Heavens continent, even entering the Nine Heavens continent required the permission of the Nine Heavens continent. Moreover, the Nine Heavens continent had arranged for many Sky Race to be in charge of guarding the periphery of the Nine Heavens continent. Any starship that wanted to enter the Nine Heavens continent had to be approved by the Nine Heavens continent. Just as Xiao Chen's starship approached the Nine Heavens continent, a starship from the Nine Heavens continent blocked their path. Subsequently, a Tao King Realm Sky Race member, who should be a steward of the Nine Heavens continent, landed on the deck of Xiao Chen's ship. Although he was only at the Tao King Realm, the steward's expression was very arrogant. Even when facing Xiao Chen's group of 6, he still didn't show much respect. The steward said indifferently, "Someone from the Sacred Palace?" Xiao Chen frowned slightly in the face of this arrogant steward. He had long heard of the Sky Race's arrogance, but he didn't expect them to be this arrogant. One must know that he was only a Tao King Realm steward, while Xiao Chen and the others were. There was no need to mention Xiao Chen, the first chosen of the Sacred Palace, while the Nine Heavens Saint and the others were all saints. A mere Tao King Realm Sky Race member dared to act so impudently in front of Xiao Chen's group. Xiao Chen was a little displeased. "Who are you? Scram and tell the first holy maiden of the Nine Heavens, Tian Yu, to come see me. You're arrogant, but I'm even more arrogant than you. A mere Tao King Realm steward dares to act so arrogantly in front of me?" Xiao Chen didn't give the steward any face at all. Author's note: I have something to do today, so I'm missing a chapter. I'll make it up tomorrow. Brothers, please forgive me. End of chapter. Chapter 1074. The sky race was no longer arrogant when facing other races. In Xiao Chen's eyes, this was already considered arrogance, especially when the other party was only a mere Tao King steward, yet he dared to act so impudently. He reprimanded without hesitation. The sky race steward was stunned when he heard Xiao Chen's words, but he immediately flew into a rage. Just as he was about to roar, a terrifying pressure erupted from the 9 heavens saint and the other 4 saints. The Tao King steward immediately retreated over a dozen steps in the face of the pressure from the 5 saints. He looked at Xiao Chen and the others with an ugly expression. The 5 saints greatly shocked the sky race steward. It was easy to imagine how much pressure the sky race steward felt when he was locked on by the auras of the 5 saints. He no longer looked as arrogant as before. He quietly swept his gaze across Xiao Chen and the others before finally asking respectfully to Xiao Chen, "May I ask?" He didn't know Xiao Chen's identity, so Xiao Chen replied indifferently, "Xiao Chen of the Sacred Palace." The sky race steward's expression changed drastically when he heard Xiao Chen's answer. "Xiao Chen of the Sacred Palace, the first chosen of the Sacred Palace." He stared blankly at Xiao Chen. He didn't expect the young man before him to be the first chosen of the Sacred Palace. With the rise of the Sacred Palace over the years, Xiao Chen's reputation as the first chosen of the Sacred Palace naturally spread far and wide. Just like how the Sacred Palace had specifically collected information about the other 6 quasi-saint sects, especially about the first Holy Son, the 6 quasi-saint sects of 9th Heaven had also collected a lot of information about the Sacred Palace. As the first Holy Son of the Sacred Palace, Xiao Chen was definitely the first to bear the brunt of this information. He was the focus of the 6 quasi-saint sections. Xiao Chen didn't make things difficult for the sky race steward. He said indifferently, "Inform Tianyue that Xiao Chen of the Sacred Palace has come to visit." He didn't want to offend the sky race steward too much. After all, they had come to 9 heavens to discuss the alliance. The chances of success weren't high to begin with, so it would be even worse if they offended 9 heavens too much. He told the steward to inform Tianyue first. The steward quickly left Xiao Chen's spaceship. It was clearly time to send the news back to 9 heavens. In the same cave abode in 90 halls, Tianyue, who had been cultivating, smiled faintly when she received a message from her subordinates that Xiao Chen of the Holy Palace had come to visit. It was as if she had expected Xiao Chen to come. It seems that the Sacred Palace didn't choose 9th Heaven. Xiao Chen's arrival meant that the Sacred Palace hadn't set their sights on 9 heavens. As for Xiao Chen's purpose in coming, Tianyue had already guessed it. Other than seeking an alliance, Xiao Chen had no reason to come to 9 heavens. The Sacred Palace wanted to ally with 9 heavens. The smile on Tianyue's face didn't fade. She immediately walked out of the cave dwelling and headed out of the 9 heavens continent. She wasn't familiar with Xiao Chen, but she was very interested in the first chosen of the Sacred Palace. Previously, 9 heavens had said that although Xiao Chen was the first chosen of the Sacred Palace, there was still a gap between his strength and the first chosen. He wasn't a threat. This was 9 heavens' evaluation of Xiao Chen. However, Tianyue felt that this information wasn't credible after seeing Xiao Chen on the 100mo continent. Although she hadn't seen Xiao Chen fight back then, her intuition told her that Xiao Chen's strength had already reached the level of the first chosen. At the very least, he wouldn't be too far behind Tong Huang. Therefore, if Xiao Chen and Tong Huang really fought on the 100mo continent, it would be hard to say who would emerge victorious. Tianyue naturally did not believe that a man who was nothing to worry about according to 9 heavens' intelligence report was actually as powerful as Emperor Tong. The only explanation was that Xiao Chen had improved. In the past few years since the establishment of the Sacred Palace, Xiao Chen had improved too quickly. He had already caught up to the first chosen of the North Star boundary. A person who had improved so quickly naturally piqued Tianyue's interest. Therefore, when she received news that Xiao Chen had arrived on the Nine Heavens continent, Tianyue didn't hesitate to head out to welcome him. Riding on a small starship, Tianyue soon arrived in front of the Sacred Palace starship. With a graceful leap, she landed on the deck of the starship. At the same time, Xiao Chen and the others walked out of the starship. Tianyue was wearing the robes of the Nine Heavens chosen this time. Although she didn't have any facial features, she gave off a completely different feeling than before. Back on the 100mo continent, Tianyue gave off the feeling of a lively and adorable girl from the Sky Clan. However, this time, under the robes of the Nine Heavens chosen, Tianyue gave off a more dignified feeling. A dignified feeling that belonged to the first saintess of the Nine Heavens. Xiao Chen cupped his hands towards Tianyue and said with a smile, "I hope Saintess Tianyue will forgive me for my sudden visit." He, since when did chosen Xiao Chen become so polite? Should I be flattered? Tianyue laughed. As soon as she spoke, Tianyue returned to being the lively and adorable little girl from the Sky Clan. However, Xiao Chen knew that this was only on the surface. This little girl was definitely an existence that would devour others without spitting out their bones. She had a lot of evil tricks up her sleeve. For example, back on the 100mo continent, she had almost caused him to fight Tong Huang. Xiao Chen still remembered her method of sowing discord. Unaffected by Tianyue's adorable appearance, Xiao Chen's smile didn't diminish. "Saintess Tianyue, you must be joking. Look at you. What, are you afraid that I'll eat you? Let's go, I'll take you to the Nine Heavens. You should want to see the patriarch, right?" Tianyue laughed. Tianyue had long guessed the purpose of Xiao Chen's visit, and she also took the initiative to offer to bring Xiao Chen and the others to the Nine Heavens. Hearing this, Xiao Chen didn't have any intention of hiding it and nodded. "Thank you." Tianyue had guessed the purpose of Xiao Chen's visit, and Xiao Chen didn't conceal it. Thus, under Tianyue's lead, the group smoothly entered the Nine Heavens continent. What a joke, with the first saintess of the Nine Heavens leading the way, who would dare to stop them? However, along the way, Tianyue did tell Xiao Chen one thing, and that was to meet the several quasi-sage great venerables of the Nine Heavens. They were all in seclusion, and it was unknown when they would come out. In addition, no one dared to disturb the quasi-sage great venerables when they were in seclusion. A bright smile flashed in her eyes. On the deck, Tianyue and Xiao Chen stood side by side. Tianyue looked at Xiao Chen and smiled. "Therefore, I'm afraid that chosen Xiao Chen will return disappointed this time. The quasi-sage great venerables are all in seclusion, and no one knows when they will come out. Begging for collection, begging for monthly votes, begging for recommendation." End of chapter. Chapter 1075. Xiao Chen had come to Nine Heavens to discuss the matter of the alliance, but from Tianyue's tone, it seemed like there wasn't much of a chance because Xiao Chen might not even be able to meet the quasi-saint great sovereigns of Nine Heavens. If he couldn't even meet them, there was naturally no chance of an alliance. Xiao Chen's expression didn't change at all when he heard Tianyue's words. "If Holy Lady Tianyue is willing to help, I believe this shouldn't be a problem." Knowing that this trip to Nine Heavens would be full of difficulties, Xiao Chen didn't care too much about the difficulties before him. Whether or not he could meet the quasi-saint great sovereigns of Nine Heavens would depend on whether Tianyue was willing to help him. As the first Holy Lady of Nine Heavens, it naturally wouldn't be a problem if Tianyue was willing to help. At the very least, Xiao Chen would be able to meet the quasi-saint great sovereigns of Nine Heavens as he wished. According to the Sacred Palace's information, there were a total of 3 quasi-saint great sovereigns in Nine Heavens. He didn't need to meet all of them, just one would be enough. Tianyue smiled brightly when she heard Xiao Chen's words. "I can help you, but why should I? You should know that our celestial race doesn't have a good impression of other races. Tian Yu admitted that she could help Xiao Chen, but there was no reason for her to do so. Xiao Chen's smile didn't fade. It doesn't matter. I'm not in a hurry anyway. It won't be a problem for me to stay in 9 heavens for a few days. He didn't have any good ideas for the time being. Moreover, the sacred palace was still in the preparation stage. Even if they wanted to make a move against the Night Ghost Pavilion, it wouldn't be done overnight. A war between quasi-saint sects wasn't something that could be fought on a whim. Many things needed to be prepared in advance. The simplest thing was a spaceship, which required a certain level of accumulation. Therefore, Xiao Chen still had a lot of time. He just needed to convince 9 heavens before the sacred palace was fully prepared. He planned to stay in 9 heavens for a while. Tian Yu smiled when she heard Xiao Chen's words and didn't say anything else. Under Tian Yue's lead, Xiao Chen's group quickly arrived at 9 heavens, which was located at the center of the 9 heavens continent. There was a huge lake, and on the surface of the lake, there were many majestic and ancient buildings. The entire 9th heaven was built on water, and the buildings were floating on the surface of the lake, showing no signs of sinking. Moreover, with just a casual glance, Xiao Chen discovered that there were many entrances to caves in 9th heaven. The entire 9th heaven was not just visible to the naked eye. There were even more caves and independent miniature worlds beneath the buildings. As expected of a secondary saint sect, its scale was in no way inferior to the sacred palace. Of course, Xiao Chen wasn't too surprised by this. As the first chosen of the sacred palace, the grandeur of 9th heaven wasn't enough to make Xiao Chen pale with fright. Xiao Chen calmly observed the 9th heaven sect before him. At the same time, the starship that he and the others were on slowly landed on a square in 9 heavens. The starship landed and the group walked down from the deck. At the same time, many disciples of 9 heavens gathered around the square one after another. 9 heavens only recruited members of the divine race, so when they saw Xiao Chen and the others appear, the disciples of 9 heavens began to discuss in low voices. Human race? Why would a human come to our 9 heavens? These humans are probably from the sacred palace. Even so, how could the heavenly saint receive them personally? The disciples of 9 heavens discussed in low voices, but their expressions weren't too friendly. On the contrary, when they looked at Xiao Chen's group, many of them revealed a faint trace of hostility. Sensing the hostility from the disciples of 9 heavens, Xiao Chen smiled helplessly in his heart. What an extremely xenophobic race! Xiao Chen had long known that this would happen, but when faced with the hostile gazes of countless people, he still felt a little helpless. He hadn't done anything yet, but the disciples of 9 heavens already hated him so much. It seemed that it wouldn't be easy to get 9 heavens to agree to the alliance. He felt a little uncomfortable. On the other hand, Tian Yue, who stood beside Xiao Chen, appeared very easygoing and calm, the bright smile on her face never disappearing. "It seems that you guys aren't very popular," she said to Xiao Chen with a smile. Hearing Tian Yu's words, Xiao Chen smiled bitterly and shook his head. However, just as he was about to reply, Tian Yu paused for a moment and the smile on his face quickly turned into a devilish charm. "Chosen Xiao Chen, you're in trouble." "I'm in trouble?" As Tian Yu's voice fell, a young man from the divine race who also wore the robes of the 9 heavens chosen appeared in front of Xiao Chen. The young man was very handsome, and he also had the unique mark of the divine race on his forehead. With the appearance of this young man, many disciples of 9 heavens became restless. There were even people who couldn't help but speak up. It's senior brother Ziyu. 9 heavens had a total of 8 chosen and saintesses, and the young man in front of them was called Ziyu. He was ranked 5th among the 8 chosen. He had never entered this chosen before, but with his appearance, Xiao Chen could still keenly feel a strong sense of hostility coming from Ziyu. Sure enough, before Xiao Chen could speak, Ziyu had already spoken first. His voice was very cold, and at the same time, there was an undisguised sense of mockery. First chosen of the sacred palace, Shao Qin, why has a human come to my 9 heavens? The moment he opened his mouth, he revealed his hostility towards Shao Qin. Hearing this, Shao Qin was a little depressed. These divine race were really a little too arrogant. He hadn't done anything yet. Just because he was a human and an outsider, the disciples of 9 heavens didn't have any good expressions towards him. Especially for someone like Ziyu, the faint murderous aura between his brows seemed to want to tear him apart. Facing Ziyu, who was filled with hostility, Shao Qin ignored him while Tianyu, who was at the side, laughed. Junior brother Ziyu is a little extreme. He has never liked outsiders. Holy son Shao Qin, you have to be careful. Ziyu's personality was rather extreme. Hearing this, Shao Qin said indifferently, "It shouldn't be a problem if we don't kill him, right?" Even a clay figurine had some anger. At this moment, he had just arrived at 9 heavens and already felt the hostility of all the disciples of 9 heavens. In addition to Ziyu's contempt and ridicule, Shao Qin naturally wasn't in a good mood. Moreover, looking at Ziyu's appearance, a battle was unavoidable. Shao Qin wasn't worried about this. He only said to Tianyue that it shouldn't be a problem if he didn't kill him. Please collect, please vote, please recommend. End of chapter. Chapter 1076. Shao Qin was indeed a little displeased by the hostility of the 9 heavens disciples. Moreover, not a single senior member of the 9 heavens had appeared after they arrived. Not even a single saint had appeared, let alone a quasi-saint. Of course, Tianyu was considered a big shot, but Tianyu and the saints of the 9 heavens had completely different meanings. The 9 heavens definitely knew that they had arrived, but not a single person had appeared. What was this? Were they looking down on them? Or did they not want to see them at all? Shao Qin had already thought about the arrogance of the 9 heavens, but he did not expect the sky race's arrogance to reach such a level. If no one came to him, there was no way to discuss the alliance. In addition, Ziyu had mocked and ridiculed him as soon as he appeared. The anger in Shao Qin's heart was accumulating bit by bit. Tianyu smiled nonchalantly when he heard Shao Qin's words. "It's fine as long as you don't cripple him. However, junior brother Ziyu is very strong." It was obvious that Shao Qin was already a little angry. Tianyu did not stop him, but instead looked forward to it. After all, there were many rumors about the first chosen of the sacred palace, Shao Qin. Some people believed that Shao Qin had already reached the level of the first chosen of the northern star boundary, while others believed that Shao Qin did not live up to his reputation. Although he was known as the first chosen of the sacred palace, there was still a large gap between Shao Qin and the other first chosen. It was precisely because everyone had different guesses about Shao Qin that Tianyu was very curious about Shao Qin's strength. Of course, this was also inseparable from Shao Qin's identity. As the first chosen of the sacred palace, Shao Qin was nominally on the same level as Tianyu. As for the 5th chosen like Ziyu, there was still a gap between the two of them. Not only was there a gap in status, but there was also a gap in strength. Hence, Tianyu wanted to see if Shao Qin's strength had reached the level of the first holy sun in the North Star realm. Was he really on equal footing with the first holy suns? The last time they were in the Biamo continent, they had missed the battle between Shao Qin and Tong Huang. Today, since Shao Qin was lucky enough to fight with Ziyu, Tianyu naturally would not stop them. Although Ziyu's strength was a little weak in Tianyu's opinion, she should be able to see some clues. She did not stop Shao Qin from wanting to fight. Hearing the conversation between the two, Ziyu, who was not far away, sneered. "Heh, do you really think that just because you're the first chosen of the sacred palace, you're already standing on the altar? In my opinion, you don't live up to your reputation as the #1 holy son. If you were placed in the other 6 great quasi-sage sects, your strength wouldn't even make it into the top 3 holy sons." In Ziyu's eyes, Xiao Chen's title as the number one holy son was simply a joke. He was not worthy of being compared to the other number one holy sons in the North Star realm. Xiao Chen did not get angry when he heard Ziyu's words. He slowly walked forward. However, as he took a step forward, the aura on Xiao Chen's body grew stronger and stronger. At the same time, the expression on his face turned icy cold. Whether he was qualified to be compared to the other number one holy sons was not up to a fifth holy son like Ziyu to judge. When Xiao Chen was less than 10 steps away from Ziyu, Xiao Chen stopped. At the same time, the initial Dao Emperor stage aura from Xiao Chen's body soared into the sky without reservation. In fact, it was huge and magnificent. Ziyu felt pressure when facing Xiao Chen. A second ago, he had scoffed at him, but now, Ziyu felt a trace of pressure from Xiao Chen. Among his peers, Ziyu had only felt such pressure from the number one holy son like Tianyu. Could it be that this fellow really has the strength of the number one holy son? Ziyu's expression did not change, but such a thought had already arisen in his heart. His aura grew stronger and stronger. Then, the perfection stage sword intent began to wreak havoc. Faced with this fierce sword intent, Ziyu had no choice but to circulate the spirit energy in his body to resist. Xiao Chen looked at Ziyu calmly. His will moved, and the dustless sword instantly appeared in his hand. As his natal divine sword, the appearance of the dustless sword caused Xiao Chen's aura to soar again. At the same time, the long sword that emitted a faint golden light also attracted the attention of the surrounding people. This is the heavenly Dao sword embryo? Looks like I still underestimated him. His gaze was fixed on the dustless sword in Xiao Chen's hand. At this moment, the smile on Tianyu's face finally disappeared and was replaced by a solemn expression. Tianyu naturally knew about the heavenly Dao sword embryo. As one of the most powerful special physiques in the world, the heavenly Dao sword embryo's reputation was too great. Compared to the heavenly Dao sword embryo, the ice god physique, the moon god physique, and the dream god physique of Qin Shuru and the other two girls were also very powerful, but they were still weaker. He did not expect Xiao Chen to be the owner of the heavenly Dao sword embryo. Tianyu knew that those who possessed the heavenly Dao sword embryo were born sword cultivators. Their strength was definitely not a joke. This was the first time he had displayed his heavenly Dao sword embryo without holding back in front of so many people. In this battle, Xiao Chen wanted to completely crush Ziyu. He wanted Ziyu to be suppressed under his sword without any ability to fight back. Therefore, Xiao Chen used his full strength the moment he attacked. With the appearance of Xiao Chen's heavenly Dao sword embryo, Tianyu already knew that Ziyu had lost this battle. He had no chance at all. Just as Tianyu thought, with the appearance of the dustless sword, Xiao Chen took a step forward and slashed down fiercely. He used the Saint-class martial skill, 9 Luo Sword Qi. It had been more than a year since Xiao Xing passed the 9 Luo Sword Qi to Xiao Chen. In this year, Xiao Chen had also successfully cultivated the 9 Luo Sword Qi to the Great Accomplishment realm. Although it was still far from the transformative realm, the terror of the 9 Luo Sword Qi had already begun to show its brilliance. Compared to a heaven-class upper-class martial skill, the power of a saint-class martial skill was definitely worlds apart. As Xiao Chen slashed out with his sword, a golden sword Qi suddenly slashed towards Ziyu. Facing Xiao Chen's attack, Ziyu's expression suddenly changed. At the same time, Tianyu, who was not far away, sighed secretly. Looks like junior brother Ziyu is going to suffer a little today. The result of the battle was already obvious. As the sword Qi whistled, Xiao Chen said to Ziyu indifferently, "Whether my title as the first saint is undeserved or not is not something you can judge. Moreover, even if my title is undeserved, you are still a little lacking." The first saint's attack was swift and decisive. That kind of power made even Ziyu, who was the fifth saint of 9 heavens, unconsciously weaker. seeking collection, seeking monthly votes, seeking recommendation. End of chapter. Chapter 1077. If it was said that Ziyu had looked down on Xiao Chen before, then now, Ziyu's heart was filled with bitterness. This was because in front of Xiao Chen, Ziyu felt an unprecedented pressure. That feeling was exactly the same as when she faced Tianyu. Xiao Chen's deadly title as the #1 holy son was just a facade? Which bastard said this? After personally experiencing Xiao Chen's terror, Ziyu knew that Xiao Chen was someone who truly stood on the divine altar of the Northern Star Realm. His strength was completely comparable to the other #1 holy sons. He tried his best to resist Xiao Chen's attack. However, if this continued, Ziyu's defeat would only be a matter of time. After more than 100 searches, Ziyu was completely at a disadvantage. Xiao Chen also seized the opportunity and slashed out. The soul slash was directly used, and the invisible sword blade ruthlessly struck Ziyu's soul. He felt the world spin and the blood in his chest surged up. He suddenly spat out a mouthful of blood. The injury to his soul caused Ziyu's movements to be stunned. When he regained his senses, Xiao Chen's Wuchen sword was already on his neck. The ice-cold blade was placed on his neck just like that. A chill instantly spread throughout his body. As long as Xiao Chen used a little strength, Ziyu's head would be moved away. Unconsciously swallowing a mouthful of saliva, Ziyu looked at Xiao Chen with a complicated gaze. Fortunately, Xiao Chen did not kill him. Although he did not like Ziyu, the two of them did not have any deep enmity. Moreover, this was 9 heavens, and he had come here to discuss the matter of the alliance with 9 heavens. Naturally, he could not kill Ziyu. Otherwise, if he offended 9 heavens to death, all his previous efforts would be for naught. He did not kill him. However, the soul slash just now was indeed enough for Ziyu to suffer. He would need at least half a month to recover. After all, it was extremely difficult to recover from a soul injury. Looking down at Ziyu from above, Xiao Chen said indifferently, "I've said it before, you're still a little lacking." His tone was as if he did not put Ziyu in his eyes. As soon as he finished speaking, Xiao Chen put away his Wuchen sword and ignored him. He turned to look at Tianyu and smiled. "Can we go now?" Teaching Ziyu a lesson was just a small interlude for Xiao Chen. However, after this incident, Xiao Chen still discovered that the surrounding disciples of Jiu Tian had changed their gazes when they looked at him. There was a trace of disdain and a trace of fear. This was a good thing. At least with this matter, there would be less trouble in the future. Hearing Xiao Chen's words, Tianyu's heart with Xiao Chen, Tianyu walked into the depths of Jiu Tian. She finally got to see Xiao Chen's strength with her own eyes. It had to be said that the strength that Xiao Chen displayed surprised Tianyu. It was stronger than she had imagined. At least from the battle just now, Tianyu asked herself that if she were to fight against Xiao Chen, she would not dare to say that she would definitely win. This was because Xiao Chen's sword technique was too unpredictable, making it impossible to guard against. Especially that last soul slash. It made one's hair stand on end. She brought Xiao Chen and the others to a courtyard. This was where Xiao Chen and the others were temporarily staying. After entering the courtyard, the 5 saints of Jiu Tian went down to check the safety of the courtyard. Only Xiao Chen and Tianyu were left to sit in the front hall. Tianyu returned to her usual appearance and said to Xiao Chen with a smile, "Holy Son Xiao Chen is really surprising. It seems that the rumors in the outside world are not credible. Who said that Holy Son Xiao Chen's title as the first Holy Son is just an undeserved reputation?" It could be said that she had acknowledged Xiao Chen's strength. However, Xiao Chen did not care and smiled. "Holy Lady Tianyu, you must be joking. I'm afraid that my strength is not enough to enter your eyes." At this point, Xiao Chen paused for a moment, then put away the smile on his face and said seriously to Tianyu, "Holy Lady Tianyu, I hope that you can help me. At least let me see the quasi-sage of Jiotian. At that time, no matter what the outcome is, I will be grateful to you." If he wanted to see the quasi-sage of Jiotian, he could only rely on Tianyu. Perhaps she had already guessed that Xiao Chen would say this, so after hearing this, Tianyu did not change her expression and continued to smile. "All right, but I can't guarantee that it will succeed." "In that case, thank you very much, Holy Lady. No matter what the outcome is, Xiao Chen will definitely remember this kindness." Xiao Chen said. Tianyu had agreed to help Xiao Chen contact the quasi-sage of Jiotian. This was already the best outcome for Xiao Chen. As for the final outcome, he could only do his best and leave it to fate. Next, he chatted with Tianyu for a while. In the end, Xiao Chen personally sent Tianyu off. It could be said that he had successfully taken the first step. Next, Xiao Chen and the rest stayed in Jiotian. Because of the hostility of the sky race towards other races, Xiao Chen and the rest did not leave the small courtyard for 9 days to avoid any trouble. They spent almost every day cultivating. It had already been 9 days, and in these 9 days, not a single one of the higher-ups of Jiotian appeared. It was as if they had forgotten the existence of Xiao Chen and the rest. During this period, only Tianyu came by twice, but there was no good news. According to Tianyu, she had already told the quasi-sage about this matter. However, it was not up to her to decide whether to see them or not. In this regard, although Xiao Chen was helpless, there was nothing he could do. On this day, Xiao Chen, the 9 Heavens Saint and the rest sat in the courtyard. They had been left out for 10 days. Jiotian's actions also made the 9 Heavens Saint and the rest unhappy. This 9 Heavens is too arrogant. Since he left us here for 10 days, he didn't even ask about us. What is the meaning of this? The Heaven Pill Saint said snappily. Hearing her words, Saint Qingju looked at Xiao Chen and said with an ugly expression, "Holy Son, what should we do now? Waiting like this is not a solution." Jiotian's actions made Xiao Chen and the rest very unhappy. If Jiotian continued to be like this, could it be that they would continue to wait here? Faced with Saint Qingju's question, Xiao Chen did not know what to do. Now that they were in their territory, what could they do if they did not want to see them? Fight their way up? That was obviously impossible. Just as the atmosphere was tense and helpless, Tianyu came. She personally went to the front hall to receive Tianyu. Seeing Xiao Chen, Tianyu was in a very good mood this time. "Holy Son Xiao Chen, the Supreme Sage has agreed to see you. How is it? Shouldn't you thank me properly? Begging for collection, begging for monthly votes, begging for recommendations." End of chapter. Chapter 1078. After 10 days, Tianyu finally brought back some good news. Upon hearing this, Xiao Chen revealed a smile on his face and said, "Of course. I will definitely keep this matter in mind." Tianyu had indeed helped a lot on this trip to 9 Heavens. Otherwise, without Tianyu, Xiao Chen wouldn't have been able to move an inch in 9 Heavens. Logically speaking, Xiao Chen and Tianyu weren't very familiar with each other. The two had only met on the Mo continent before, so there wasn't much of a friendship between them. But even so, Tianyu was willing to help this time, which made Xiao Chen a little curious. After taking their seats in the front hall, Xiao Chen relaxed when the quasi-saint Great Sovereign of 9 Heavens was finally willing to meet him. Although he didn't know what the outcome would be, as long as they could meet, it meant that there was still a chance. After taking a sip of tea, Xiao Chen looked at Tianyu and said, "Holy Lady Tianyu, can I ask you a question? I've helped you so much, why are you still so polite? Can't you just call me by my name?" Tianyu smiled brightly when she heard Xiao Chen's words. All along, Xiao Chen's attitude towards Tianyu was respectful and distant. On the surface, it seemed good, but in fact, Xiao Chen had never acted intimately with Tianyu. For example, in terms of address, Xiao Chen had always called her Holy Lady Tianyu. Xiao Chun was slightly taken aback when he heard Tian Yu's words, but he immediately corrected himself and said, Tian Yu, can I ask you a question? You want to ask why I helped you, right? Tian Yu had already guessed what Xiao Chen wanted to ask. Seeing this, Xiao Chen didn't hide anything and nodded, indicating that Tian Yu's guess was right. He was indeed very curious about why Tian Yu had helped him. Tian Yu smiled when she saw Xiao Chen nod. It's very simple, it's because it's fun. Your sacred palace wants to stir up the muddy waters of the North Star boundary, so I, 9 heavens, naturally don't want to stay out of it. But don't be happy too early. I only persuaded the great sovereign to meet you, I didn't say that I've agreed to meet you. As for the final result, it's still up to you to work hard. It was a very strange reason. Tian Yue chose to help Xiao Chen because it was fun. Hearing this, Xiao Chen smiled bitterly. After getting along with Tian Yue, Xiao Chen more or less understood this woman's character. She was definitely a woman who was more lawless than Gu Lingyao. She was definitely someone who wanted to see the world in chaos. Xiao Chen nodded after hearing Tian Yu's words. Then, the two of them agreed to meet the 9th Heavens quasi-sage tomorrow. After chatting with Tian Yu for a while and sending her off, Xiao Chen also returned to the backyard and informed the 5 saints of the matter. Hearing that the quasi-sage of 9 heavens had finally agreed to meet Xiao Chen, the 5 of them were secretly happy. As long as they could meet, there was still a chance for things to turn around. Moreover, it was better than being left out here. After 10 days there was finally progress. After a night of silence, Tian Yu arrived as promised. Then, Xiao Chen was led by Tian Yu to the cave dwelling of one of the quasi-sage great sovereigns in 9 heavens. Only Xiao Chen went, while the 5 saints waited in the courtyard. This was the quasi-sage great sovereign's intention. She only wanted to meet Xiao Chen. There were a total of 3 quasi-sage great sovereigns in 9 heavens, and today, Xiao Chen was going to meet one of them. Her name was Tian Yun, the only female among the 3 quasi-sage great sovereigns. She was also the quasi-sage great sovereign who had the best relationship with Tian Yu. Therefore, under Tian Yu's persuasion, Tian Yun agreed to meet Xiao Chen. Of course, although it was only meeting Tian Yun alone, as long as he could persuade her, it would be considered a success. After all, if one of the quasi-sage great sovereigns agreed to form an alliance with the sacred palace, then the other 2 wouldn't be a problem. Under Tian Yu's lead, the 2 of them came to a cave dwelling in the depths of 9 heavens. They entered through the entrance. This was Supreme Sovereign Tian Yu's residence. The cave dwelling was very large, with mountains and rivers. Beside a sparkling lake, Xiao Chen finally met Supreme Sovereign Tian Yun. She was wearing a white dress. Her appearance couldn't be said to be devastatingly beautiful, but her elegant temperament gave off an otherworldly feeling. She was like a fairy that had fallen to the mortal world. Her ink-black hair naturally fell to her waist as she sat cross-legged by the lake. It wasn't until Xiao Chen and Supreme Sovereign Tian Yun walked in that she slowly opened her eyes. The corners of her mouth curved into a faint smile as she looked at Tian Yu. Girl, are you that impatient? Tian Yu came very early. Regarding this, Great Sovereign Heavenly Rhyme deliberately teased her. Hearing this, Tian Yu stepped forward and pulled Great Sovereign Heavenly Rhyme's arm. While shaking it, she said coquettishly, I'm worried that Great Sovereign has gone into seclusion again. It was obvious that the relationship between Supreme Sovereign Tian Yu and Supreme Sovereign Tian Yun was very good. After the 2 of them chatted and laughed for a while, Supreme Sovereign Tian Yun looked at Xiao Chen. She didn't give off an overbearing aura, but Xiao Chen still felt a lot of pressure when Supreme Sovereign Tian Yun looked at him. After all, the seemingly kind and beautiful woman in front of him was one of the top existences in the North Star boundary. Moreover, Supreme Sovereign Tian Yun's cultivation was higher than Xiao Xing's. Although Xiao Xing's group was also in the quasi-saint realm, they were only at the beginning of the quasi-saint realm. On the other hand, Supreme Sovereign Tianyun already had the strength of the greater quasi-saint realm. Supreme Sovereign Tianyun said slowly after looking at Shao Chen with a smile in her eyes. Who is the sacred palace's target? Shao Chen didn't hide anything from Supreme Sovereign Tianyun and said truthfully. The Night Ghost Pavilion. The sacred palace's first target was the Night Ghost Pavilion. Hearing this, Supreme Sovereign Tianyun's expression didn't change at all. She smiled and said, as expected, the Night Ghost Pavilion seized the most human territory and resources back then. It's only natural that they would choose the Night Ghost Pavilion. Supreme Sovereign Tianyun wasn't surprised that the Sacred Palace had set their target on the Night Ghost Pavilion. She continued without waiting for Shao Chen to speak. In fact, I understand the significance of the Sacred Palace joining forces with 9 heavens. However, our sky race has never liked to join forces with outsiders. I'm afraid the current situation isn't enough for me to agree to the Sacred Palace's request. Putting everything else aside, your Sacred Palace only has 2 quasi-saint supreme sovereigns, and they've only just stepped into the quasi-saint realm. With such strength, you're much weaker than the Night Ghost Pavilion. Why should my 9 heavens join forces with the weak? Supreme Sovereign Tianyun's words were very direct. Although the Sacred Palace was a quasi-saint sect, it was too weak. 2 quasi-saint supreme sovereigns who had only just stepped into the quasi-saint realm. Such strength was indeed a little weak compared to the other 6 quasi-saint sections. Facing the weakest Sacred Palace, there seemed to be no reason for 9 heavens to join forces with them. Begging for collection, begging for monthly votes, begging for recommendations. End of chapter. Chapter 1079. Based on the current situation, the Sacred Palace was the weakest among the 7 quasi-saint sects in the North Star boundary. This could be seen from the quasi-saint Great Venerables present. After all, the Sacred Palace had just been established. Shao Xing and the others had only broken through to the quasi-saint realm a few years ago, and their cultivation was only at the entry level of the quasi-saint Great Venerables. On the other hand, the quasi-saint Great Venerables of the other 6 quasi-saint sects were almost all beyond the entry level of the quasi-saint realm. It was even rumored that there were perfected quasi-saint realm existences in these 6 quasi-saint sects. This was the shortcoming of the Sacred Palace, and it was also a shortcoming that could not be ignored. Great Venerate Tianyun said bluntly. Shao Chen did not deny this. However, there was one thing that the world did not know, and that was the hidden strength of the Sacred Palace. On the surface, the Sacred Palace seemed to only have 2 quasi-saint Great Venerables, Shao Xing and Mengjie, and their strength was very weak. However, there were also Randang and Ice Lotus in the dark. In total, the Sacred Palace had a total of 4 quasi-saint Great Venerables, which doubled the number. Although in terms of battle strength, Shao Xing and the others might still be inferior to the quasi-saint Great Venerables of the other 6 quasi-saint sects, 4 quasi-saint Great Venerables were enough to raise the threat of the Sacred Palace to another level. Therefore, upon hearing Great Venerate Tianyun's words, Shao Chen had no intention of hiding anything and said calmly, "Great Venerate is right, but how can Great Venerate be sure that there are only 2 quasi-saints in my Sacred Palace?" Shao Chen's words were very clever. He did not tell Great Venerate Tianyun all the details of the Sacred Palace, but at the same time clearly stated that there were definitely more than 2 quasi-saint Great Venerables in the Sacred Palace. But as for how many quasi-saint Great Venerables there were, it was up to Great Venerate Tianyun to guess. Moreover, Shao Chen's words also increased the importance of the Sacred Palace in Great Venerate Tianyun's heart. There were also the hidden quasi-saint Great Venerables. In this way, the threat of the Sacred Palace was self-evident. Sure enough, Great Venerate Tianyun's eyes narrowed slightly when she heard Shao Chen's words. "You're still hiding something? I'm afraid this is the Sacred Palace's trump card." He didn't doubt Shao Chen's words, because this kind of thing couldn't be deceived. The truth would come out sooner or later. Hearing Supreme Sovereign Tianyun's words, Shao Chun smiled and said, "The sacred palace has just been established, so it's naturally unavoidable to have some necessary backup plans. Otherwise, how could we have a foothold in the North Star boundary?" The sacred palace still had hidden forces, and Shao Chun had already said what needed to be said. Now, it was up to Supreme Sovereign Tianyun to choose whether to form an alliance with the sacred palace or directly refuse. Shao Chun didn't speak again. Instead, he waited calmly for Supreme Venerate Tianyun's answer. She naturally saw through Shao Chun's thoughts. Deep down, Supreme Venerate Tianyun admired Shao Chun a little. He knew when to advance and when to retreat. Even in front of her, Shao Chun had been very calm from beginning to end. Such performance was indeed worthy of his title as the first chosen of the sacred palace. She didn't dislike Shao Chun, and there was also Tian Yu's persuasion. From Tian Yu's personal point of view, she hoped to form an alliance with the sacred palace. As for the reason, as she said, it was for fun. After a moment of silence, Supreme Venerate Tianyun had an answer. She looked at Shao Chun and said indifferently, "I can agree to form an alliance with the sacred palace." Shao Chun was overjoyed when he heard Supreme Venerate Tianyun's words, but after a pause, Supreme Venerate Tianyun continued, "But there are conditions. 9 heavens could agree to the alliance, but there were conditions." Shao Chun suppressed the joy in his heart and cupped his hands towards Supreme Venerate Tianyun. "Please speak, Supreme Venerate." He didn't agree rashly, but first asked for Supreme Venerate Tianyun's conditions. Supreme Venerate Tianyun nodded with a smile and stated her conditions. Supreme Venerate Tianyun's conditions were actually very simple. First, it was a matter of benefit. If 9 heavens were to form an alliance with the sacred palace, the sacred palace would have to give 9 heavens 20% of the benefit. In other words, no matter the outcome of this battle, 9 heavens would have to take 20%. Second, Supreme Venerate Tianyun wanted the sacred palace to persuade the Supreme Venerate sect and the Liwang sect. Only when the Supreme Venerate sect and the Liwang sect agreed to the alliance would 9 heavens choose to form an alliance with the sacred palace. As for the reason, it was very simple. In Supreme Venerate Tianyun's opinion, an alliance between 9 heavens and the sacred palace was far from enough to deal with the Night Ghost Pavilion, because the Night Ghost Pavilion was no fool. They would definitely find an alliance. Therefore, the Supreme Venerate sect and the Liwang sect had to join before 9 heavens would choose to form an alliance. This was the second condition. Shao Chun didn't have any objections to the first 2 conditions of Supreme Venerate Tianyun. After all, it was very normal and very reasonable. Without much hesitation, he agreed to the first 2 conditions of Supreme Venerate Tianyun. He originally thought that the matter would be settled like this, but when Supreme Venerate Tianyun mentioned the last condition, Shao Chun was a little confused. The third condition of Supreme Venerate Tianyun was to have Shao Chun accompany Tianyu to the Sky Race's forbidden area to search for the Sky Race's supreme inheritance, the Heavenly Emperor record. Shao Chun didn't know much about the forbidden area of the Sky Race, but he had heard of it. The reason was very simple. It was because Above Heavens was too famous in the North Star boundary. According to the ancient records, Above Heavens was created by the first patriarch of the Sky Race and the founder of 9 heavens, the Heavenly Emperor. The Heavenly Emperor had a great sage cultivation. A small world created by a great sage was something that even a quasi-saint couldn't forcefully break open. At the same time, after creating Above Heavens, the Heavenly Emperor had left behind his lifelong inheritance called the Heavenly Emperor record. He had also laid down a restriction that only the younger generation could enter. Clearly, he wanted to pass his inheritance on to the most talented person of the Sky Race. Therefore, countless saints and saintesses of 9 heavens had gone to above heavens over the countless years, but without exception, not a single one had returned. In the end, 9 heavens had no choice but to set a rule that only the first saint could enter above heavens. But even so, the first saint of 9 heavens had never been able to come out of above heavens. It was practically a land of death. And now, as the first saintess of 9 heavens, Tian-Yu naturally had the qualifications to go to above heavens. However, because she wasn't confident, she hadn't gone. When he heard that Tian-Yun wanted him and Tian-Yu to go to above heavens, Shao Chen hesitated. This place was simply a land of death. Countless first saints and saintesses of 9 heavens had died there. Shao Chen didn't think that his strength had surpassed the previous first saints and saintesses of 9 heavens. With some hesitation, Shao Chen looked at Tian-Yun and asked, "May I ask, Great Venerable, if above heavens is a forbidden area of the sky race, why do you want me, an outsider, to enter with Tian-Yu? Begging for collection, begging for monthly votes, begging for recommendations." End of chapter. Chapter 1080. Above heavens was very dangerous. It could be said that there was no chance of survival. However, to the sky race, above heavens was a treasure land and a holy land. This was because it was the only small world that the Heavenly Emperor had personally created. It also retained the Heavenly Emperor's inheritance. The Heavenly Emperor was the only great saint in the history of the sky race. It could be said that since the birth of the sky race in the North Star boundary, the Heavenly Emperor was the object of worship in the hearts of all the sky race. He was the symbol of the sky race. Therefore, the sky race had an almost abnormal obsession with the Heavenly Emperor record. This was also why the first saints and saintesses of 9 heavens knew that above heavens was dangerous but still wanted to enter and find the Heavenly Emperor record. Logically speaking, the sky race would never allow an outsider to enter such an important place. Facing Shao Chen's question, Great Senior Tian-Yun smiled faintly. Because with Tian-Yu's strength alone, she can't enter above heavens. She needs help. Because Tian-Yu's strength wasn't enough, they wanted Shao Chen to go with her. It was a simple and crude reason, but it was also very reasonable. However, Shao Chen didn't agree. Great Senior, if you want to help Tian-Yu, you can just let the other saints of 9 heavens go with her. Why do you want me, an outsider, to go with her? The reason was sufficient, but it wasn't enough to convince Shao Chen. Tian-Yu wasn't the only saintess in 9 heavens. Hearing Shao Chen's words, Great Senior Tian-Yun replied, "Let's put it this way. Other than the first saint, the others are just sending themselves to their deaths. At that time, not only will they not be able to help Tian-Yu, they might even drag her down. Therefore, only the first saint can enter above heavens with Tian-Yu. As for what you want to ask, you can ask the other first saint. Why do I need you? The reason is very simple. It's because I don't feel at ease. The Heavenly Emperor record is the treasure of my sky race. If other people are greedy and snatch the Heavenly Emperor record, the loss to my sky race will be immeasurable. As for you, I believe you won't and can't snatch the Heavenly Emperor record, right?" Great Senior Tian-Yun explained slowly. Now that the Holy Palace was going to form an alliance with the 9 heavens, even if Shao Chen and Tian-Yu were to successfully find the Emperor's record, he would not be able to do anything, because the Holy Palace still had to form an alliance with the 9 heavens. The reason was very good. Looking at Great Senior Tian-Yun with a resentful look, Shao Chen said helplessly, "Does this mean I don't have the right to refuse?" He didn't tell Shao Chen that although above heavens was dangerous, the celestial race had never stopped their research on above heavens. After countless generations of hard work, the danger level of above heavens had decreased by a lot. In addition to the strength of Shao Chen and Tian-Yu, they did have a chance to enter the Heavenly Emperor record. Although there was a slight difference between a 9 out of 10 chance of survival and a 10 out of 10 chance of survival, this slight difference had two completely different meanings. 10 out of 10 chance of survival meant certain death. 9 out of 10 chance of survival meant that there was a chance of survival. Great Senior Tian Yun didn't tell Xiao Chen the secret of the Heavenly Emperor record. After all, this time, Xiao Chen only played the role of assisting Tian Yu. The authority was still in Tian Yu's hands. Therefore, it wouldn't be good for Xiao Chen to know too much. What Great Senior Tian Yun wanted was for Xiao Chen to lend Tian Yu a hand. Great opportunities. He didn't know if he could come out alive after entering the Heavenly Emperor record. It was too early to talk about a great opportunity now. Therefore, Xiao Chen naturally chose to ignore it. Instead of immediately agreeing to Great Senior Tian Yun's request, Xiao Chen weighed the pros and cons. He could see that if he refused, 9 heavens would no longer choose to ally with the Sacred Palace. If that happened, things would become a little troublesome. If 9 heavens changed sides and sided with the Night Ghost Pavilion, the Sacred Palace would be in danger of being destroyed. Once the Sacred Palace was destroyed, his fate was obvious. As the first chosen of the Sacred Palace, Xiao Chen believed that the Night Ghost Pavilion wouldn't let him off. Xiao Chen knew very well that if the Sacred Palace was destroyed, Xiao Chen wouldn't have an easy time either. Great Senior Tian Yun really had a death grip on him. It seemed that Great Senior Tian Yun had already thought of this before meeting him, which was why she had agreed to meet him. Xiao Chen didn't have a choice at all. Moreover, he didn't dislike Tian Yu. If he could help her, Xiao Chen naturally didn't want to refuse. From the bottom of his heart, Xiao Chen didn't want to see Tian Yu die in above heavens like the previous first chosen of 9 heavens. Thinking of this, Xiao Chen exhaled a mouthful of turbid air. His expression turned serious as he looked at Great Senior Tian Yun and asked, "If I agree to enter above heavens with Tian Yu and help her, will 9 heavens ally with the Sacred Palace regardless of the outcome?" "Yes, and no matter what the situation is, 9 heavens will never change sides. We will live and die with the Sacred Palace," Great Senior Tian Yun replied seriously. With Great Senior Tian Yun's words, Xiao Chen nodded. "All right, then I agree." After agreeing to all of Great Senior Tian Yun's conditions, Great Senior Tian Yun also told Xiao Chen that he would enter above heavens with Tian Yu in 3 days. Furthermore, 9 heavens would send people to the Sacred Palace tomorrow to discuss the alliance. Xiao Chen agreed to Great Senior Tian Yun's request, and Great Senior Tian Yun also showed enough sincerity by taking the initiative to send people to the Sacred Palace. As a result, the alliance between the two was successfully set. The only question now was whether or not Xiao Chen could come out of above heavens alive. Upon hearing Supreme Sovereign Tian Yun's last words, Xiao Chen bowed to her and then left the cave dwelling with Tian Yu. They would enter the above heavens in 3 days, so they naturally had to prepare. Begging for collection, begging for monthly votes, begging for recommendations. End of chapter. Chapter 1081. On the way back after leaving Great Senior Tian Yun's cave house, Tian Yu looked at Xiao Chen with a smile and said, "Why? You don't want to go to above heavens? Are you afraid of dying in there with me?" Facing Tian Yu's teasing, Xiao Chen turned to look at her. Although this little girl was about the same age as him, her character was extremely lively and cheerful. She was also extraordinarily courageous. She only wanted to see the world in chaos. Hearing her words, Xiao Chen said angrily, "What's the use of being afraid? Knowing that it's a fire pit, I still have to jump in." After spending some time together, Xiao Chen and Tian Yu had become familiar with each other, so they could joke around when they talked. Neither of them would take it to heart. Hearing Xiao Chen's words, Tian Yu rolled her eyes. But before she could speak, Xiao Chen continued, but his voice was obviously laughing a lot. Moreover, his tone was also very low. "Moreover, I don't want to see you fall in above heavens like the previous first holy son and holy maiden of 9 heavens. Xiao Chen's sudden words made Tianyu stunned, but then she smiled again, but there was a hint of sweetness in her smile. Perhaps it was because Xiao Chen was the first man to say such words to her. As the first holy maiden of 9 heavens, Tianyu's identity destined the men around her to stay away from her. It was even more impossible for them to say anything to protect her because Tianyu didn't need anyone to protect her at all. Now Tianyu could feel the care and concern from Xiao Chen, and she felt warm in her heart. It was unknown what Tianyu was thinking at this time. Xiao Chen was a little conflicted about above heavens, but at the same time, he was also looking forward to it. After all, this was a small world built by a great sage. What kind of existence was a great sage? Xiao Chen didn't know, but Xiao Chen understood that a quasi-sage was almost not worth mentioning in front of a great sage. Let's put it this way. If the North Star Realm had a great saint at this time, they didn't need one. As long as there was one, the situation of the entire North Star Realm would be completely different. At that time, it would most likely be a situation where only one of them reigned supreme. It was a pity that there hadn't been a great saint in the North Star Realm for many, many years. The extinction of the great saint had also led to everyone knowing that there was still the existence of the great saint realm above the quasi-saint realm. However, no one knew how quasi-saints broke through to the great saint realm. Did they rely on the power of the source? I'm afraid that's not all. It was related to the great sage, so above heavens was very dangerous. At the same time, it was also very tempting. Especially for people like Xiao Chen, the temptation of above heavens was extremely huge. The danger to his life was nothing to Xiao Chen. After all, Xiao Chen had been through a lot of dangers along the way. Moreover, if it weren't for these dangers, would Xiao Chen still be able to reach his current height? Danger and opportunity often coexisted. Therefore, Xiao Chen quickly adjusted his mentality and even had a sense of longing for the trip to above heavens. He returned to the small courtyard where he lived. Before parting, Xiao Chen said to Tianyu, "Prepare well. Since there's a glimmer of hope, I think we'd better work hard to grasp it." "I don't need you to say that. I'm not someone who wants to die. If I can live, who wants to die? You should be the one who should prepare well. Otherwise, wouldn't your 3 wives be heartbroken?" "Humph." Hearing Xiao Chen's words, Tianyu snorted softly, then turned and left. Neither of them noticed that Tianyu's tone became a little strange when she talked about Xiao Chen's 3 wives. After sending Tianyu off, Xiao Chen returned to the courtyard and met with the 5 saints of the 9 firmament. He also told them in detail about his meeting with Supreme Sovereign Tianyun. When they heard that Supreme Sovereign Tianyun had agreed to form an alliance with the Sacred Palace, the 5 of them were overjoyed. But when they heard that Supreme Sovereign Tianyun wanted Xiao Chen and Tianyu to enter above heavens together, they immediately fell silent. Saint Danyun was the first to reject. "Chener, you can't. You can't enter above heavens. It's too dangerous." Saint Danyun was the first to disagree. Soon after, the 9 firmaments saint and the others also spoke up. They didn't agree with Xiao Chen entering above heavens because it was too dangerous. Since the 5 of them didn't agree with Xiao Chen entering above heavens, Xiao Chen could only patiently persuade them. "It's fine. Although above heavens is dangerous, it's not certain death. Also, this is the only way 9 firmaments will agree to form an alliance with the Sacred Palace." After persuading them patiently, Xiao Chen's persuasion and Xiao Chen's determination, the 5 of them reluctantly agreed. However, the 5 of them still gave Xiao Chen their pills and talismans so that he could keep them for himself when he entered above heavens. Xiao Chen naturally wouldn't refuse the talismans and pills given to him by the 5 of them. He knew that these things were life-saving treasures, and the more he had, the better his chances of survival would be. After handing over many pills and talismans, Xiao Chen discussed with the 5 of them. Tomorrow, Supreme Sovereign Tianyun would send people to the sacred palace. Xiao Chen's intention was for the 5 of them to return with him. As for himself, he would stay in 9 firmaments and return to the sacred palace after the matter with above heavens was concluded. Xiao Chen had his own opinions. Therefore, the 5 saints had no choice but to agree to Xiao Chen's decision, even though they were reluctant to do so. The next morning, as expected, Grand Elder Tianyun sent 3 saints from the 9 heavens over. Moreover, there was a holy sun accompanying them. Xiao Chen had seen this person before. It was indeed the 5th holy son of the 9 heavens, Ziyu. However, Ziyu was much more obedient this time and didn't provoke Xiao Chen. On the contrary, he was extremely low-key. Xiao Chen was naturally happy to see this happen. Sending Ziyu and the 3 saints to the sacred palace was a show of the importance 9 firmaments placed on this alliance. Without wasting any time, the group left 9 firmaments on the same day and hurried towards the sacred palace. As such, Xiao Chen was left alone in 9 firmaments. After sending off the 9 firmament saints, Xiao Chen spent the next 2 days very relaxed. He didn't cultivate, nor did he go out. Instead, he did his best to prepare for above heavens, adjusting himself to his peak condition. 2 days passed in the blink of an eye. On the 3rd day, Tianyu found Xiao Chen early in the morning and brought Xiao Chen to the lake in the depths of 9 firmament. When the 2 arrived, Supreme Sovereign Tianyun and the other quasi-saint from 9 firmaments were already waiting. Seeing the 2 arrive, Supreme Sovereign Tianyun smiled at Xiao Chen, while the other quasi-saint Supreme Sovereign expressionlessly said to Xiao Chen, 9 firmaments has already agreed to form an alliance with the sacred palace. You must do your best to help Tianyu obtain the Heavenly Emperor's record. If I find out that you're cheating, the alliance will be nullified. Begging for collection, begging for monthly votes, begging for recommendations. End of chapter. Chapter 1082. Compared to Supreme Sovereign Tianyun, this male Supreme Sovereign's attitude towards Xiao Chen was much worse. He spoke as if he was interrogating a criminal. Of course, this male Supreme Sovereign was also a Supreme Sovereign. Xiao Chen wouldn't go all out to help Tianyu, so he felt the need to warn Xiao Chen not to play any tricks. Xiao Chen ignored the male Supreme Sovereign's reprimand. Instead, he turned to Supreme Sovereign Tianyun and asked, "When are we going to enter above heavens?" The male Grand Monarch was infuriated by Xiao Chen's action, and he bellowed with a dark expression. "You!" The male Grand Monarch snarled. He was clearly angered by Xiao Chen's disregard, but fortunately, Supreme Sovereign Tianyun stopped him in time. "All right, since we have chosen to form an alliance, we have to trust each other. Xiao Chen is the first chosen of the sacred palace. I don't think he's that weak. Since he said he would help Tianyu, he will definitely do his best." Supreme Sovereign Tianyun believed in Xiao Chen. Of course, a large part of the reason was because of Tianyu, because Tianyu had put in a lot of good words for her. As soon as Supreme Sovereign Tianyun's voice fell, the male Supreme Sovereign didn't say anything else and just snorted coldly. At the same time, Supreme Sovereign Tianyun turned to Xiao Chen again and said with a smile, "Anytime. Do you see this whirlpool?" As she spoke, Supreme Venerable Tianyun pointed. Xiao Chen looked in the direction of her finger and saw a whirlpool with a diameter of more than 10 meters on the surface of the lake. It was constantly spinning above the lake. This is the entrance to the above heavens. The above heavens was built by the Heavenly Emperor Great Sage. Therefore, the entrance will only open on a certain day every month. Apart from that, even we can't open the entrance. Today is the day the entrance opens. The 2 of you can enter the above heavens anytime, explained Great Paragon Tianyun. Against the above heavens, Great Paragon Tianyun and the others were helpless. The seals left behind by the Heavenly Emperor Great Sage were too terrifying. Even they couldn't break them. Therefore, they could only follow the rules of the heavenly emperor great sage. Looking at the entrance to above heavens, Shao Chen pondered for a moment before turning to Tian Yu and saying, "Let's go." Now that things had come to this, there was no longer any need to hesitate. No matter how dangerous the heavens realm was, they had no choice but to give it a try. Tian Yu nodded after hearing Shao Chen's words. Subsequently, the two of them jumped into the whirlpool under the gazes of Supreme Sovereign Tian Yun and another male Supreme Sovereign. They quickly disappeared. Watching the two disappear, Supreme Sovereign Tian Yun's eyes flashed with a complicated look. She prayed in her heart, "Girl, you must succeed." It was unknown when it started, but roaming the above heavens seemed to have become the mission of every holy son and holy daughter of the 9 heavens. Almost every holy son and holy daughter of the 9 heavens had died in the above heavens, and Tian Yu was no exception. However, Supreme Sovereign Tian Yun was extremely worried about this, but it was too late to say anything now. Are we really going to form an alliance with the Sacred Palace? The male Supreme Sovereign snorted coldly. Upon hearing this, Supreme Venerate Tian Yun said with some dissatisfaction, "Saint Child Shao Chen has already kept his promise by entering above heavens with Tian Yu. What, as a quasi-sage Supreme Venerate, are you going to go back on your word? But the Sacred Palace is an outsider after all. So what if it's an outsider? Can you find someone more suitable than Holy Son, Shao Chen, to accompany Tian Yu to the Heavenly Emperor's sky?" Supreme Sovereign Tian Yun said coldly. Shao Chen kept his promise, and Supreme Sovereign Tian Yun wouldn't go back on her word either. The male Supreme Sovereign's expression turned ugly after being reprimanded by Supreme Sovereign Tian Yun, but he still sighed in the end. "All right, I'll leave it to you." With that, the male Supreme Sovereign left, leaving Supreme Sovereign Tian Yun standing on the spot and looking at the entrance to the above heavens for a while. But after a while she also left. No one could help Shao Chen and Tian Yu in the above heavens. They could only rely on their own luck. After the two Supreme Sovereigns left, Shao Chen and Tian Yu passed through the entrance and entered the above heavens. It was no different from the outside world, with blue skies and white clouds. The only difference was that the above heavens seemed to be an uncivilized world. The entire above heavens gave off an ancient and backward feeling. Looking around, there were dense forests everywhere. After sizing up the surroundings, Shao Chen turned to Tian Yu and asked, "Do you have any clues as to where the Heaven Emperor record is located in the above heavens?" He still didn't know how big the above heavens was. If Tian Yu had a rough location, it would undoubtedly be much easier to find it. Tian Yu didn't hide anything when she heard Shao Chen's question. "I know. Above the 9 heavens, the above heavens is actually composed of 9 independent small worlds." After entering above heavens, Tian Yu told Shao Chen everything she knew. However, after hearing Tian Yu's explanation, Shao Chen suddenly felt like he had been cheated. He originally thought that he had placed a lot of importance on the above heavens, but who knew that the real above heavens was much more dangerous than he had imagined. First of all, the above heavens was composed of 9 independent small worlds. These 9 small worlds were connected to each other, but they were also a whole. As for the Heaven Emperor record, it was located at the highest 9 heavens. As for where Shao Chen and Tian Yu were now, it was located at the lowest first heaven. In other words, if they wanted to obtain the Heaven Emperor record, Shao Chen and Tian Yu would have to overcome all difficulties and reach the 9th heaven. Only then would they have a chance of obtaining the Heaven Emperor record. However, it was extremely difficult to reach the 9th heaven. This was because every time they ascended a heaven, they would have to go to the center of that heaven. Only there would be a passage to the next heaven. Right now, we should be at the edge of the first heaven. In other words, if we want to reach the 2nd heaven, we have to advance towards the center? Shao Chen asked. Tian Yu nodded in response. All right, he had still underestimated the above heavens. Although he still didn't know what dangers lay in the above heavens, Xiao Qian was certain that it wouldn't be easy. However, there was no turning back now. They could only brace themselves and advance. Standing up, Xiao Qian and Tian Yu walked towards the center of the first heaven. They didn't know how big the first heaven was, but when Xiao Qian and Tian Yu walked through the dense forest, they were incomparably careful. They were constantly on guard against every movement in their surroundings, fearing that they would be suddenly attacked by something. Begging for collection, begging for monthly votes, begging for recommendations. End of chapter. Chapter 1083. Because they were very careful along the way, Xiao Qian and Tian Yu's speed wasn't fast. It could even be said that they were very slow. However, what was a little strange was that after walking for about 4 hours, the two didn't encounter any danger. Slowly, Tian Yu relaxed a little. However, Xiao Qian didn't agree with this and even reminded her, "Don't relax, be careful." Nothing happened. This wasn't good news for Xiao Qian. One must know that this sky above heavens had buried many generations of holy sons and holy daughters of 9 heavens. Would this sky above heavens be ordinary if it could make so many holy sons and holy daughters fall here? Obviously not. Therefore, the peace along the way didn't mean safety in Xiao Qian's opinion. On the contrary, this kind of peace gave people a strange feeling all the time. However, in the face of Xiao Qian's slightly reprimanding reminder, Tian Yu did not take it to heart. She curled her lips and said, "Humph, what danger is there? We have been walking for almost 4 hours and nothing has happened. Moreover, this is only the first heaven, so it should be the simplest. I think we should not waste our energy here. You know, there are 9 heavens above the heavens, and the higher you go, the more difficult it is." The little girl wasn't convinced. She felt that Xiao Qian was a little too cautious and sensitive. However, Xiao Qian completely scoffed at this. He was getting more and more familiar with Tian Yu. Xiao Qian also knew that this girl's growth process could be described as smooth sailing. First of all, her background wasn't bad. She could already be considered as one of the top in the sky race. Secondly, she had shown excellent talent since she was young. Then, she entered 9 heavens early and received the vigorous training of 9 heavens. In the end, she became the holy daughter of 9 heavens. Until now, she was even the first holy daughter of 9 heavens. Her growth experience could be said to be smooth sailing. This also meant that Tian Yu actually didn't experience any setback. On the other hand, Xiao Qian was able to reach this step today because Xiao Qian had experienced countless hardship. Therefore, in terms of survival skills, Xiao Qian was definitely several streets ahead of Tian Yu. This had nothing to do with strength, but came from experience and a sense of danger. It was precisely because he had experienced so many life and death crises that Xiao Qian had an almost instinctive intuition towards the approaching danger. After entering the first sky, Xiao Qian felt that something was wrong. Therefore, even though nothing happened along the way, Xiao Qian still didn't relax his vigilance. The little girl didn't believe him, so Xiao Qian didn't say anything else. He knew very well that it was almost impossible to make Tian Yu listen to him. The girl was arrogant, and she was the first holy maiden of the 9 heavens. Xiao Qian naturally couldn't order her around. Tian Yu thought that everything was fine and secretly relaxed. On the other hand, Xiao Qian's nerves were stretched taut as he vigilantly observed the surroundings for any signs of trouble. About half an hour later, Tian Yu, who had been following behind Xiao Qian and had completely relaxed, suddenly let out a shriek. Upon hearing Tian Yu's shriek, Xiao Qian turned around immediately and saw a black vine wrapped tightly around Tian Yu's ankle, pulling her out of danger into the dense forest behind. It was a very strange attack. Just as Xiao Qian was focusing all his attention on Tian Yu, he heard Tian Yu, who had been struggling non-stop, suddenly shout, "Xiao Qian, be careful! Behind you, Tianyu reminded him, but it was too late. A similar vine climbed up Xiao Chen's neck at lightning speed and strangled Xiao Chen. Xiao Chen and Tianyu were both strangled by the strange vines. However, Xiao Chen and Tianyu were no ordinary people. Very quickly, the two of them attacked at the same time. Xiao Chen was surrounded by sword aura, and in an instant, the vines that were strangling his neck were cut apart. As for Tianyu, her body was enveloped in a white glow. Under the glow, the vines seemed to have dissolved and disappeared without a trace. It didn't take much effort for the two of them to break free from the vines. However, this was clearly just the beginning. Just as the two of them broke free, even more vines attacked them from all directions. These vines seemed to have a life of their own as they attacked them from all directions. Upon seeing this, Xiao Xing's dustless sword instantly appeared in his hand. With the dustless sword in hand, he slashed out fiercely and displayed the square sky sword shadow. In an instant, the sky was filled with sword shadows. The surrounding vines, trees, and weeds were all razed to the ground by the countless sword aura. The dense forest that blocked their line of sight was sliced apart by Xiao Chen's sword. At the same time, the instigator of all this finally appeared before Xiao Chen and Tianyu. Without the obstruction of the dense forest, Xiao Chen and Yi Zichen were able to see more than 10 black trees more than 10 meters tall surrounding the two of them at some point in time. Not only could these black trees move, but their branches were also the black vines that trapped them earlier. At this moment, they were constantly swaying, trying to attack them. Looking at these black trees, Xiao Chen frowned slightly because he recognized the identity of these black trees. Ever since he knew about the vastness of the North Star Realm, Xiao Chen had read a lot of strange books. These books had nothing to do with cultivation. Instead, they introduced the various interesting stories of the North Star Realm, as well as the human geography. The main reason he read these books was to increase his knowledge. He didn't expect that it would really come in handy today. Xiao Chen had once seen an introduction about these black trees in a book. He frowned slightly and spoke as if he was talking to himself. Ancient Ghost Withered Vine. These black trees were the Ancient Ghost Withered Vine. It was said that the Ancient Ghost Withered Vine was a ferocious creature in the North Star Realm during the ancient times. Although it was a plant, the Ancient Ghost Withered Vine could move. Moreover, its spiritual intelligence was low and its actions were driven by instinct. It was said that the Ancient Ghost Withered Vine had a huge appetite and was never picky about food. Regardless of whether it was the human race, the heavenly race, or the beast race, as long as it was meat, the Ancient Ghost Withered Vine would eat it. It was due to this reason that in the ancient times, as long as there were Ancient Ghost Withered Vines, there would definitely be no other living creatures. This was because with the Ancient Ghost Withered Vine's training, it would quickly devour all living creatures in the surroundings, leaving nothing behind. Xiao Chen recognized the Ancient Ghost Withered Vine. On the other side, Tianyu naturally also recognized the Ancient Ghost Withered Vine. At this moment, she exclaimed in surprise. Weren't the Ancient Ghost Withered Vines extinct a long time ago? How could it be? Seeking collection, monthly votes, recommendation. End of chapter. Chapter 1084. The ancient ghost withered vines that were supposed to be extinct had actually appeared before Xiao Chen and Tianyu. Facing more than 10 ancient ghost withered vines, Xiao Chen smiled bitterly. Above heavens is indeed a land of death. The first heaven is already so difficult. Above heavens had a total of 9 heavens. At this moment, Xiao Chen and Tianyu were only at the first heaven. Facing more than 10 ancient ghost withered vines, their expressions became extremely solemn. The most infuriating thing about the ancient ghost withered vines was their vitality. In terms of attack power, the ancient ghost withered vines might be ordinary. However, in terms of vitality, these ancient ghost withered vines were extremely terrifying. At this moment, Xiao Chen and Tian Yu were facing 15 ancient ghost withered vines. The situation was indeed not good. After glancing at the ancient ghost withered vines with a solemn expression, Xiao Chen quickly regained his composure and said to Tian Yu, "We can only think of a way to quickly eliminate these guys. If we fight a protracted battle, the two of us will be exhausted sooner or later. Ending the battle quickly was the best method. Regardless of the race, it was impossible to win against the ancient ghost withered vines. This was because the ancient ghost withered vines did not rely on spiritual energy during battle. As such, there would be no exhaustion. On the other hand, regardless of the race, the warriors of the other races would need to rely on spiritual energy during battle. As such, there would naturally be a time when they would be exhausted. They could only strike like lightning and quickly kill these ancient ghost withered vines." Without waiting for Tian Yu's reply, Xiao Chen continued to speak. "Let's do it. Don't hold back." He reminded Tian Yu that this was not the time to hold back. Hearing this, Tian Yu nodded silently. She naturally understood this principle. Facing 15 ancient ghost withered vines, she would be a fool if she still wanted to hold back her strength. After speaking, the two of them launched their attacks at the same time. They headed towards different directions and each targeted an ancient ghost withered vine. Holding the dustless sword, Xiao Chen fiercely slashed out with the sacred class martial skill, 9 Sifting Sword Qi. The ancient ghost vine used a sacred tier martial skill as soon as it attacked. However, in the face of Xiao Chen's 9 Sifting Sword Qi, the ancient ghost vine was smart. It used its branches to form several defensive lines to defend against Xiao Chen's 9 Sifting Sword Qi. Jian Feng fiercely landed on the branch. Although the ancient ghost vine's branch was tough, it was still cut off by a sacred level martial skill. However, there were too many branches. After layers of interception, the power of the 9 Siv Sword Qi was already less than 10%. In the end, when it was still a few meters away from the main trunk, it directly dissipated. The 9 Sifting Sword Qi did not manage to severely injure the ancient ghost withered vine, but it did manage to break through its defenses. However, as soon as the 9 Sifting Sword Qi dissipated, the branches that had been severed by the 9 Sifting Sword Qi started to regenerate rapidly. This was the terrifying aspect of the ancient ghost withered vine. As long as one did not deal a fatal blow to it, it would quickly recover with its terrifying vitality. Seeing that the branches were regenerating at an extremely fast speed, Xiao Chen did not hesitate. He directly pointed his finger and used another sacred tier martial skill, the Fish Intestine Sword Finger. Currently, Xiao Chen had mastered 2 sacred tier martial skills, the 9 Sifting Sword Qi and the Fish Intestine Sword Finger. In order to quickly kill the ancient ghost vine, Xiao Chen did not care about the consumption of spiritual energy. He continuously used the 9 Sifting Sword Qi and the Fish Intestine Sword Finger. As he pointed his finger, a green sword light flashed. As the sword light slashed across, the space was torn apart inch by inch. The ground was also torn apart like a piece of paper. As the 6th finger of the 9 Heavens Sword Finger, the Fish Intestine Sword Finger's power had definitely reached the level of a sacred tier martial skill. At this moment, as the green sword light attacked, the ancient ghost withered vine, which had its defenses broken by the 9 Sifting Sword Qi, was completely unobstructed. The Fish Intestine Sword Finger fiercely hit the ancient ghost withered vine's trunk. After a moment of shaking, the ancient ghost withered vine's trunk was directly penetrated by the Fish Intestine Sword Finger. The damage to the trunk was definitely fatal. Moreover, the sharp sword energy contained in the Fish Intestine Sword Finger had also destroyed the ancient ghost withered vine's vitality from the inside. 2 moves were enough to kill an ancient ghost withered vine. However, it was not easy because just these 2 moves had depleted a quarter of the spiritual energy in Xiao Chen's body. Such a terrifying consumption of spiritual energy was only in exchange for killing a mere ancient ghost withered vine. At this moment, there were still more than 10 ancient ghost withered vines in front of Shao Chen and Jian Wushuang. At this rate of consumption, it would be difficult to kill all the ancient ghost withered vines. However, there was no other way. After killing the first ancient ghost withered vine, Shao Chen did not hesitate and directly rushed towards the second ancient ghost withered vine. At the same time, Shao Chen carelessly stuffed a handful of elixirs into his mouth and began to recover his spiritual energy. Although he knew that there would be side effects if he consumed such a large amount of elixirs, Shao Chen could not care less about the side effects. He could only give it his all. At the same time that Shao Chen killed the first ancient ghost withered vine, Tian Yu had also killed a group of ancient ghost withered vines. Like Shao Chen, Tian Yu had also used a sacred class martial skill. At this moment, the mark on Tian Yu's forehead was emitting bursts of white light. That aura was indeed extremely terrifying. However, Shao Chen was not in the mood to pay attention to Tian Yu's terrifying combat power. Resolving the crisis in front of him was the most urgent matter. He was not stingy with the consumption of his spiritual energy. As long as he could kill the ancient ghost withered vines as quickly as possible, it would be fine. One by one, the ancient ghost withered vines were quickly killed by Shao Chen and Tian Yu. However, in the end, when there were only 3 ancient ghost withered vines left, Shao Chen and Tian Yu's spiritual energy had already been depleted. There was no other choice. The consumption of a sacred class martial skill was too great. During this period, Shao Chen had killed 5 ancient ghost withered vines while Tian Yu had killed 7. Tian Yu, who had unleashed his full power, was indeed stronger than Shao Chen in terms of strength. There was no more spiritual energy in their bodies. Furthermore, there were many injuries on their bodies. After a tough battle, there were only 3 ancient ghost withered vines left. However, Shao Chen and Tian Yu were truly exhausted. With a pale face and a forehead full of sweat, Shao Chen said weakly with a bitter smile, "These guys are really troublesome. Don't tell me that even with the 2 of us working together, we still can't pass the first heaven?" Under normal circumstances, Shao Chen would not have cared about these 3 ancient ghost withered vines at all. But now, the 2 of them had already killed 12 ancient ghost withered vines. Facing the remaining 3 ancient ghost withered vines, they really did not have the strength to deal with them. Begging for collection, begging for monthly votes, begging for recommendations. End of chapter. Chapter 1085. They had just entered the above heavens, and the 2 of them were already in a perilous situation. Shao Chen felt extremely bitter in his heart. If he had some time to recover, he was confident that he could kill the last 3 ancient ghost withered vines. Even if it was just an hour, Shao Chen was confident that he could kill the last 3 ancient ghost withered vines. Unfortunately, this was impossible. At this moment, the 3 ancient ghost withered vines attacks had already arrived, attacking Shao Chen and Duan Ling Tian from all directions. Shao Chen smiled bitterly. However, at this moment Tian Yu, who was also pale, suddenly looked at Shao Chen and revealed a somewhat strange smile. "You have to keep what you see next a secret for me, okay?" Hearing this, Shao Chen was stunned at first. However, before he could say anything, the mark on Tian Yu's forehead shone brightly. At the same time, Tian Yu's entire body seemed to have turned into a black hole and began to crazily devour the surrounding spiritual energy of heaven and earth. The surrounding heaven and earth spirit chi seemed to have been sucked into Tian Yu's body in the most simple and crude way. Following this massive amount of spirit chi entering her body, Tian Yu's originally extremely weak aura became even more violent at this moment. It was even more terrifying than when she was at her peak. All these changes happened in the blink of an eye. When Tian Yu's aura became violent again, the attacks of the 3 ancient ghost withered vines arrived as expected. However, Tianyu had a faint smile on her face. She waved her hand, and a huge palm fell from the sky and pressed on the ground, enveloping Xiao Chen and Duan Ling Tian. This huge palm of spiritual energy was like a protective shield that protected the two of them. Within the huge palm, the attacks of the ancient ghost withered vines could not hurt Xiao Chen and Duan Ling Tian. Xiao Chen was taken aback when he saw Tianyu, who seemed to have come back to life all of a sudden. However, he quickly regained his senses. He was somewhat astonished, but also somewhat helpless as he bitterly laughed. Heaven-devouring spiritual body Tianyu was actually the possessor of the heaven-devouring spiritual body. The heaven-devouring spiritual body was one of the most terrifying physiques in the world. Even compared to Xiao Chen's Heaven Path Sword embryo, it was not inferior. The most terrifying part of the heaven-devouring spiritual body was that it could devour spiritual energy for its own use. This ability should not be underestimated. It was absolutely terrifying. However, there was a drawback to the heaven-devouring spiritual body. When the heaven-devouring spiritual body was used, it could devour spiritual energy for its own use. After all, the spiritual energy was not refined by the user. There would be a period of weakness. Even so, the heaven-devouring spiritual body was absolutely terrifying. When the heaven-devouring spiritual body, due to the huge amount of spiritual energy entering the body, one's strength would increase. Tianyu's current state. Tianyu was clearly a lamp without oil. Tianyu's aura. Little brother? Hearing Tianyu's words, Xiao Chen was speechless. In terms of age, Tianyu was indeed a few years older than him. But now, she actually called him Xiao Chen's little brother. Perhaps because he had relaxed, Xiao Chen sat on the ground without any scruples. He said to Tianyu unhappily, Okay, I'll keep it a secret. But when did I become your little brother? You are younger than me. Aren't you my little brother? Alright, little brother, rest here. I'll be back soon. Tianyu chose to ignore Xiao Chen's dissatisfaction and resistance. She said with a smile on her face. After saying that, she walked out of the protection of the giant palm and went straight for the 3 ancient ghost vines. As for whether Tianyu could kill the 3 ancient ghost vines, Xiao Chen was not worried at all. With the heaven-devouring spiritual body, Tianyu's strength was now stronger than when she was at her peak. She did not need to worry about killing the 3 ancient ghost vines. After completely relaxing, Xiao Chen closed his eyes and sat cross-legged. He did not care about the attacks of the 3 ancient ghost vines. Anyway, with the giant palm of spiritual energy left by Tianyu, these attacks could not hurt him at all. Xiao Chen focused on recovering the spiritual energy in his body. In the above heavens, it was very dangerous to not have any spiritual energy. Therefore, Xiao Chen had to recover as soon as possible. Moreover, although Tianyu was very strong now, she would also fall into a weakened state. After all, the spiritual energy absorbed by the heaven-devouring spiritual body did not belong to her. Once the heaven-devouring spiritual body stopped operating, the spiritual energy in her body would naturally dissipate into nothingness. No longer caring about Tianyu's battle, Xiao Chen focused on recovering the spiritual energy in his body. After about the time it took to drink a cup of tea, Tianyu successfully killed the last 3 ancient ghost vines. When she returned to Xiao Chen's side, the giant palm of spiritual energy protecting Xiao Chen had disappeared. Tianyu's face had turned pale again, even paler than before. Her aura was also extremely weak. Just as Tianyu sat cross-legged beside Xiao Chen slowly opened his eyes and took out a few elixirs from his storage ring and handed them to Tianyu. Quickly heal your injuries. Feeling Xiao Chen's faint concern, Tianyu did not stand on ceremony. She smiled, took the elixirs from Xiao Chen, and swallowed them in one gulp. The two of them sat side by side. However, Xiao Chen did not dare to be careless at this time. While recovering the spiritual energy in his body, he observed the surroundings. At this time, Tianyu was definitely at her weakest. Therefore, Xiao Chen could only take on the responsibility of being vigilant. Time passed by slowly. After 4 hours, Xiao Chen opened his eyes first. With the help of the elixirs, Xiao Chen's spiritual energy had almost recovered. Sensing Xiao Chen's movements, Tianyu, who had not fully recovered, opened her eyes at this time and smiled at Xiao Chen. The sap of the ancient ghost vines is good stuff. It is very helpful for forging the body. We are not in a hurry. You should refine the sap. The sap of the ancient ghost vines was very helpful for forging the body. Hearing this, Xiao Chen smiled and said, "It seems that our battle was not in vain. Okay, I will leave half of it for you." The two of them fought side by side. Now that they had obtained the spoils of war, Xiao Chen naturally would not take it all for himself. However, hearing this, Tianyu shook her head. "I don't want it. I don't even forge the body. What use do I have for it? I will give it all to you. Just treat it as a reward from Big Sister to thank Little Brother for accompanying me to this above heavens." As she spoke, the expression in Tianyu's eyes became very bright. The more she called Xiao Chen Big Sister and Little Brother, the more Tianyu got used to it. Especially when she saw the black lines on Xiao Chen's forehead, Tianyu smiled even more beautifully. Begging for collection, begging for monthly votes, begging for recommendations. End of chapter. You're tuning in to the Phoenix Knights YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.